Hi guys. Tonight we drift back to a time when the hum of the modern world was only beginning, when New York City still smelled faintly of horse leather, wood smoke, and salt from the harbor. It is March 1888, and you are strolling through the streets on the eve of what will be called the Great Blizzard. The lamps burn dim, carriages clatter lazily, and a few late workers pull their coats tighter against a damp chill. It feels like ordinary weather, the kind that makes you hurry home but not worry too much. You notice the sky looks strange, a pale, heavy grey that refuses to clear. Somewhere above the rooftops, clouds are forming an agreement to end your week rather dramatically. You probably won't survive this, at least not without an excellent story to tell. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights. You can almost hear the city breathing as night settles in. The harbor bells clang gently. The East River glimmers with reflections of gaslight. People hurry to board the last ferries, their boots sloshing through half-frozen puddles. In small apartments, coal fires hiss and pop. Housewives tuck children beneath wool blankets. Everything feels secure, contained, predictable. The newspapers mention a storm possible in the mid-Atlantic region, but forecasts in 1888 are like vague gossip. They hint, they hope, they mostly guess. The U.S. Weather Bureau is still young, and its telegram reports arrive too late to warn anyone properly. By midnight, a light flurry begins to drift over the cobblestones. You brush it from your coat collar and smile. Snow in March isn't so rare, though it seems out of place with the first buds of spring poking through city gardens. A lamplighter curses softly as flakes melt against his hat brim. Horses shake their manes, the flakes glinting in the dim light like tiny shards of glass. The city, always noisy, grows oddly muffled. Inside a boarding house on 23rd Street, you sit by a stove with a mug of weak coffee, listening to distant wheels squeal against frozen rails. The innkeeper laughs about the bit of weather, assuring everyone it will pass by morning. You nod along, half listening, half lulled by the hypnotic rhythm of sleet ticking at the window. There's something beautiful about storms before they reveal their teeth. Historians still debate whether early signs of the blizzard were visible from Washington, D.C. the day before. Some argue that atmospheric pressure readings hinted at disaster. Others say the instruments were too crude to detect what was coming. Either way, no one in New York knows that two storm systems, one from the Great Lakes, another from the south, are colliding right above the eastern seaboard. The result will be a meteorological monster that buries the Northeast under up to 55 inches of snow. A quirky fact to ponder as you sip your imaginary coffee. The telegraph operators on duty that night likely heard the first clues in the form of static tiny crackles of electricity caused by ice forming on their lines. They probably tapped out a few half-garbled warnings before everything went dead. Those sounds, unnoticed by most, were the whispers of the storm's arrival. You step outside for one last look before bed. The snow has thickened, swirling in little spirals that catch the lamplight. A policeman passes by, his cape flapping like a shadow. "Better stay in tonight," he mutters, though his voice carries more friendliness than fear. You smile, tipping your hat, and he vanishes into the white curtain forming down the avenue. Somewhere a door slams. Somewhere else a child giggles at the sight of the snow, pressing a palm to the frosty glass. You walk home through a landscape turning soft and unfamiliar. The ruts in the street are filling fast. You can barely see the outlines of the brownstones. The air smells clean, metallic, alive. When you reach your stoop, you pause to listen. The city's pulse is slowing. No carriages, no chatter, just the sigh of wind curling between buildings. You might even mistake it for peace. In the tenement districts, people hurry to fill water pails and bank fires. Coal deliveries were late today, and that will matter soon. One family on the Lower East Side uses old newspapers as insulation, pressing them into window cracks. A grocer boards up his storefront just in case. The storm is coming, but no one has language big enough yet to describe it. A bit of weather will become a legend by sunrise. You slip inside, stamping your boots, hanging your coat near the stove. A clock ticks steadily. The cat curls on a chair, blissfully unaware. The sound of wind builds outside, first a low hum, then a deeper moan that makes the windows shiver. You close the curtains. It feels oddly safe to be enclosed, as if the walls themselves will hold the cold at bay. You think about the milkman, the night watchman, the ferry crews. They are still out there, tiny dots in a thickening white sea. In another part of the city, a night train whistles as it crosses a bridge. The sound is faint, swallowed almost instantly by the rising wind. You imagine the engineer leaning forward, squinting through a blur of snow, unaware that by morning he will be stranded miles from any station. Somewhere a street musician packs away his violin, muttering about the devil's breath in the air. Even the city rats retreat to basements tonight. It is, after all, the calm before something extraordinary. By 2 a.m. temperatures plummet. The flakes that felt soft an hour ago now sting your cheeks like tiny blades. The gaslights flicker. A newspaper boy, too poor to quit his route, drags a sack through ankle-deep slush. He hums to keep himself awake. You wonder if he makes it home. Historians later estimate that more than 400 people across the region will not. Yet for now, there is still warmth, still laughter, still denial. A few blocks away, a journalist notes in his diary, a peculiar stillness precedes the snow's advance. The air feels hollow. That diary, now brittle and yellow, survives in a library, one of the few first-hand records from that first night. It's strange to think how many memories froze and vanished along with the bodies they belonged to. Before you sleep, you crack the window a little, listening. The wind has changed direction, gusting harder from the northeast. It smells of the sea. The temperature continues to drop. You shiver, pulling the quilt tighter, thinking of the horse drivers who must keep their animals moving until dawn. The last thing you hear before sleep is the faint sound of a shutter banging loose somewhere above you. The great blizzard of 1888 has already begun its work, quietly, almost politely. By morning, politeness will be gone. When you wake, the world has changed. The window pane glows with a soft, dim whiteness that looks almost kind at first glance. You think it must still be early, perhaps dawn smothered by thick clouds. But when you pull the curtain aside, there is no sky, no street, no horizon, just a blinding, swirling wall of snow pressed against the glass. The storm has found its full voice overnight, and it howls like an animal determined to swallow everything it can reach. You press your hand to the cold glass, and your breath fogs it instantly. Beyond the window, shapes shift and vanish. The nearest gaslight is gone, buried beneath a dune that looks like frozen smoke. Somewhere below, you think you hear a man shouting, but the wind tears his words apart before they reach you. This is not the gentle snowfall that put you to sleep. It's something feral, something almost alive. You pull on your heaviest coat, though it hardly matters. Inside, the chill seeps through every wall and seam. The coal fire struggles, hissing and flickering like a tired heartbeat. You crouch to feed it more fuel, watching orange sparks snap upward. The kettle on the stove rattles from the draft, sneaking through the window frame. The room feels smaller than it did last night, the outside pressing in from every direction. Somewhere in the distance, a bell clangs, perhaps a ferry horn or a church tower, but even those familiar sounds seem distorted, as if they're echoing through snow instead of air. You open the front door carefully, and the world greets you with a wall of white up to your chest. The wind punches you in the face, stealing your breath. Snow rushes inside immediately, swirling over the floor. You slam the door shut and lean against it, panting. Going out is impossible. For now, you are trapped. Historians still argue whether the storm reached hurricane-force gusts in parts of Manhattan, or if the readings were exaggerated by terrified observers. Barometers from that day show air pressure dropping faster than anyone had recorded in the city before. The term nor'easter wasn't widely used yet, but that's what it was. A roaring tempest born from colliding warm and cold fronts, fueled by moisture from the Atlantic. It hit at just the wrong moment when people were unprepared and communications fragile. A quirky little fact buried in old weather journals says that one man in Brooklyn tied a red ribbon to his roof before the storm so he could measure the snow depth by seeing how far it disappeared. By noon, the ribbon was invisible. He never found it again. You move to the back window, hoping for a better view, but everything there is white too. The air outside seems thick enough to touch, swirling like milk poured into water. The sound of the wind is constant, but within that roar are smaller sounds. Sharp whips, deep groans, occasional cracks like distant gunfire. Those are telegraph poles breaking, wires snapping, roofs shifting under the weight of snow. It feels as though the city itself is cracking. In the tenements, families gather around meager stoves, burning anything that will catch: broken chairs, old newspapers, scraps of floorboard. The air fills with the sour scent of smoke and boiled potatoes. Children wrap scarves over their faces to warm the air before they breathe it. You can almost hear their coughing. Out on the avenues, those who dared to travel now stumble blind. Horses panic and bolt, their hooves clattering until the sound fades into nothing. The city's famous elevated trains stop running. Frozen tracks buckle. Engines fail. Passengers huddle in their carriages, shivering in the dark. Somewhere along the East River, a ferry is stuck mid-channel, passengers clutching each other for warmth as ice forms along the hull. And you, safe for now inside your fragile shelter, feel the strange guilt of survival. You think of the milkmen who never made their morning rounds, of the policemen who vanished in white streets trying to guide lost citizens home. Newspapers will later describe bodies found standing upright, frozen mid-step, as if time itself stopped between one breath and the next. You glance again at your window, half expecting to see a face out there, but there's only swirling snow, shifting endlessly. Historians love to quote the number 400 for the death toll, but that's a guess. Records from small towns were incomplete. Some bodies were found weeks later when the thaw came. Others, likely, were never found at all. The storm was democratic in its cruelty. It took bankers and beggars alike. Still, it is said that some parts of the city were strangely beautiful that morning. Their filigreed iron fences glazed with frost, icicles hanging like glass daggers from every cornice. You can imagine it, an entire metropolis turned into an ice sculpture. The sound of footsteps above you makes you jump. Someone on the roof may be clearing a vent or just checking for leaks. You call out, but your voice vanishes. No reply. The storm is too loud, too hungry. The clock on the mantel ticks faintly, steady and absurdly calm. You wonder if time can really keep its pace while everything else stops. Historians still debate whether the cold or the wind was deadlier. Some argue it was the collapse of infrastructure, the telegraph, the railways, the ferries that turned a storm into a catastrophe. Others point out that such collapses forced cities to modernize. You'll see the seeds of that later, but right now all you see is snow, endless and alive, drifting higher by the hour. A neighbor knocks faintly at your wall, a prearranged signal between apartments. You knock back to show you're safe. The sound is faint, muffled by insulation and weather. You imagine the woman next door, her shawl pulled tight, trying to heat soup on a tiny stove. You picture her cat hiding under the bed. Somehow that image feels more human than anything outside. Another hour passes, though it's impossible to tell without sunlight. You light a candle. The flame bends under the drafts, sneaking through the room. The world smells of wax and damp wool. You sip lukewarm tea, wondering how long this can last. You remember a line from the newspaper you read yesterday. Mild conditions expected through the week. You almost laugh. A sound too small for the storm to notice. The snow presses harder against the door now, as if the storm wants to come in and see what you're doing. You sit back in your chair and listen to it breathe. The wind rattles a loose shingle somewhere, steady as a drumbeat. The whole house creaks in rhythm, a wooden heart groaning under pressure. If you close your eyes, it sounds like the ocean, a vast, invisible tide rising against your walls. It's strange how easily land and sea trade places in weather like this. You drift between wakefulness and uneasy rest, the kind of half-sleep where you keep one ear tuned for disaster. Somewhere, someone is surely still out there trying to get home, trudging against the wind. And you, lucky or not, are here to listen to their footsteps fading into snow. You wake again to silence, but not the kind that brings peace. It is a thick, unnatural quiet, the sort that follows chaos. The fire has gone out. The air feels heavy, motionless. When you reach for the window, frost cracks beneath your fingertips like brittle sugar. Outside, the world is erased. The buildings opposite your street have vanished behind a glimmering wall of snow. Even sound seems frozen. You try to open the window a little, but it refuses to budge. Ice has sealed it tight. The only movement comes from the faint swirl of snow sneaking through cracks around the sill. You pull your scarf tighter, half expecting the storm to fling itself at you again, but it has changed tactics. The howling wind of yesterday has become a quieter, more sinister force, still deadly, only disguised. Downstairs, the front door refuses to open. You press your shoulder against it, but the drift outside holds firm. You're sealed in, like an insect trapped in amber. The thought would be funny if it weren't so real. You imagine the rest of the city trapped the same way, every home a tiny snow cocoon. It's a well-documented truth that by this morning, telegraph wires across New England had already collapsed. Communication between cities was gone. No one in New York knew what was happening in Boston, or Philadelphia, or even a few blocks away. The country, used to its new speed of messages and markets, found itself suddenly deaf and blind. Some historians suggest this single day proved how dependent the modern world had already become on invisible connections. A lesser-known detail whispers that a few clever New Yorkers, desperate for news, climbed to their rooftops and waved colored flags to signal neighbors. Blue meant safe, red meant send help. No one knows if those signals reached anyone, but people kept waving anyway, stubborn against the white silence. You stand there, trying to imagine what life felt like before the hum of electricity and the buzz of phones. When all you had was sight and voice, cut off by a few feet of snow, the world must have felt enormous. A man could be trapped just 2 houses away, and you'd never know. Experts continue to disagree about the exact temperature that morning. Some reports claim it fell to 10 degrees below zero. Others insist it was warmer but felt worse due to wind chill, a concept barely understood then. Whatever the number, it is cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes. You think about the laborers who slept in boarding houses with no prop heat, their breath crystallizing against the walls as they dreamed. The smell of coal smoke drifts faintly through the cracks. Somewhere nearby, a neighbor must have coaxed a fire back to life. You envy them for a moment before setting to work yourself. The stove groans reluctantly but catches, filling the room with a thin orange glow. The sound of the kindling crackling feels like company. You make tea with melted snow. It tastes metallic, as though you're sipping the air itself. The steam rises and curls, painting slow ghosts in the cold light. You think about the dock workers who won't see the harbour today, the ferrymen staring at walls of ice where the river used to be. Contemporary accounts describe how the snow came in waves, each more vicious than the last. Some streets filled so quickly that people were buried while trying to clear paths. A doctor attempting to reach a patient in Brooklyn reportedly vanished mid-block, only to be found 2 days later under 6 feet of drift, still clutching his bag. Yet there were strange beauties too. Letters from survivors speak of how the air glowed at night, reflecting from snow crystals until the city seemed lit from within. Some swore the light was pink, others blue. One woman wrote, "It was as though the heavens had fallen and found us worthy of their shine." A peculiar footnote worth mentioning. Some residents tried to keep their shop signs visible by carving tunnels through the snow to the street. Customers could crawl through these icy corridors to reach a bakery or apothecary. It sounds absurd, but a few such passages were sketched by an artist later that week. Imagine it business as usual, except underground, encased in ice. You press your ear against the wall and catch faint sounds from next door. Someone playing a harmonica, maybe out of boredom or sheer defiance. The melody wobbles but holds steady, like hope refusing to die. You hum along under your breath. No consensus exists among academics as to whether this blizzard truly marked the birth of modern meteorology in America, but many agree it forced change. The failure to warn the public was an embarrassment. Within months, weather reporting was reorganized, new observation stations built, and telegraph routes hardened against storms. You are living through a tragedy that will make the world smarter, though no one here can know that yet. The hours drift by slowly. You pace from room to room, watching the candlelight slide across frozen windows. Somewhere outside, faintly, a crash echoes a roof, perhaps, giving in under weight. You picture snow pouring through rafters like liquid glass. You take stock of what you have left. Half a loaf of bread, a bit of salt pork, 2 candles, some coal. It will have to last. You find yourself thinking of the farmers farther north, whose livestock are surely trapped or lost. City dwellers often mocked them, but tonight, the distance between farm and tenement feels thin. Everyone is just another creature trying to outlast the cold. Oddly enough, some letters written after the storm mention time seemed to slow down completely. People describe days that felt like weeks, hours that refused to pass. You sense that same distortion now. The tick of your clock feels louder, almost intrusive, like it's measuring not minutes but endurance. Even now, interpretations vary widely on how individuals survived emotionally. Some accounts speak of panic, others mention laughter and community, as neighbors shared food and stories through walls and cracks. It's strange how disaster can bring both despair and tenderness in equal measure. You add more coal to the fire and settle close, knees tucked to your chest. The world outside remains invisible, but you can feel it shifting, snow piling, winds resting, the city sleeping beneath a heavy white blanket. Somewhere, surely, the first thoughts of rescue are already stirring. For now, though, you breathe in the quiet and listen to the soft groan of the house that's keeping you safe. The wind returns by dawn, rattling the shutters like a restless ghost. You open your eyes to darkness, though it's already morning. The storm has buried your windows, sealing out the light completely. When you touch the pane, the cold bites through your fingertips. You can feel the weight of the snow pressing against the glass, as if the outside world is trying to come in and take your warmth for itself. Your breath fogs in the air. The stove has died again. The air inside the room carries that metallic chill that settles into the bones and refuses to leave. You shuffle to the coal box, which is almost empty now. Each lump feels heavier than gold. You drop 2 pieces into the stove and wait for the fire to catch. The sound of crackling flame feels like a heartbeat returning after too long a silence. Records from the time confirm that on this second morning, thousands of New Yorkers found themselves imprisoned in their own homes. Some apartment doors opened directly onto solid snowbanks. Windows cracked under pressure. Roofs sagged dangerously. The city was no longer a city, but a landscape of mounds and hollows, like a frozen sea with chimneys poking through. A small but vivid rumor said that some people dug out their chimneys by climbing through attics with shovels, emerging like moles into blinding daylight. Whether true or not, it captures the absurd bravery of those who refused to let smoke stop rising from their homes. You boil a little snow again for water, the kettle trembling faintly on the stove. The flame gives the room a golden halo, small but enough. You think of those who have no coal left, who burn chair legs and old boxes to keep from freezing. The scent of scorched varnish drifts through the air outside, unmistakable even through the sealed windows. Outside, the wind howls steadily, though it no longer feels angry. It's simply there, vast and relentless. You imagine all the families across the city huddled by stoves, their faces lit orange, and eyes fixed on the same uncertain hope that someone will come, or that the storm will stop, whichever happens first. What's certain from the newspapers of the day is that New York's economy stopped completely. No deliveries, no work, no open markets. Milk spoiled, meat froze solid. For the first time in living memory, even the Wall Street traders stayed home. Yet the silence this brought had a strange comfort. The city that never rested had finally been forced to pause. Curiously, a few people treated the moment as adventure. Diaries tell of young men sliding down buried rooftops, shouting with laughter, their joy echoing over streets filled with danger. One entry from a woman on the Upper West Side describes children tunneling between houses to visit friends. She called them snow fairies, appearing from nowhere, trailing laughter behind them. Researchers remain divided on what the greatest hardship truly was: the cold, the hunger, or the isolation. Some point to the collapse of communication, others to the psychological strain of confinement. Imagine living without knowing if the rest of your city even still exists beyond the nearest drift. It's not fear exactly, but a hollow sort of wonder. You picture the families sitting in their kitchens, bundled in blankets, whispering stories to pass the time. Maybe they read aloud from newspapers printed days ago, pretending they're still part of a living world. Maybe they sing. In times like these, even a hymn sounds like rebellion. You wrap yourself tighter and listen for human sound. There are faint noises, a shovel scraping somewhere above, a muffled shout that might be a name. You knock twice on the wall, a simple signal, and wait. After a moment, you hear two knocks back. Someone else is still there. The relief is quiet but real. According to surviving archives, rescue attempts had already begun by this time. Police and volunteers tied ropes around their waists, venturing into the white maze to check for stranded citizens. They worked in pairs, guided by memory and faith, moving from doorway to doorway. The few who returned told stories of carriages buried so deep that only the tips of wheels showed, and of people who had fallen asleep in drifts, mistaken for statues. One strange anecdote claims that a man in Brooklyn harnessed his street Bernard to deliver messages between houses. The dog carried notes tied to its collar, moving through tunnels dug by desperate neighbors. The story's truth is uncertain, but it has survived more than a century, which might say something about the hope people needed to believe in. You spend most of the day tending to the fire, melting more snow, and writing in the margin of an old newspaper your own small record of survival. The act feels unnecessary and yet meaningful, a way to remind yourself that time still exists. You date the corner of the paper carefully, in case anyone ever reads it. No agreement exists among modern historians on how many people actually froze inside their homes rather than outside. Some accounts suggest the majority of deaths came from exposure indoors, where stoves failed and fuel ran out. It's a detail most forget, that dying from cold does not always mean being caught in the open. Sometimes it means simply being forgotten. Evening settles early again, the light fading from grey to black. You listen to the wind slow, then stop altogether, as though the storm itself has grown tired. The silence that follows feels deeper than any sound. You imagine the whole city exhaling at once. Somewhere far off, perhaps across the river, a bell begins to ring. It's faint and uneven, maybe a church or a ferry alarm still echoing through ice. You close your eyes and imagine the sound carrying through buried streets, reminding everyone still trapped that the world beyond the snow hasn't vanished completely. You lie down near the stove, listening to the gentle crackle of the last coal. The floor beneath you creaks with every gust of wind. You wonder what tomorrow will look like, if it will bring rescue, or another white morning of the same. You do not know yet that the storm will last another day, that this frozen calm is only the eye of something far from done. When morning arrives, the storm hasn't ended. It has simply changed shape. The wind screams again, louder and sharper, driving snow through every gap like tiny knives. You wake to the smell of smoke and realize someone nearby must have lost control of their stove. You can almost see the dark plume twisting through the air outside, swallowed quickly by the white. You press your ear to the wall but hear nothing. The world is reduced to the hiss of snow and the moan of wind through shutters. Every sound feels stretched, distant, unreal. You rub your hands together until they burn with warmth, then crouch near the fire to coax another weak flame from the few lumps of coal that remain. It catches, barely, a small defiance against a city-sized storm. Eyewitness accounts agree that the snow now lay in drifts taller than an average man. Avenues vanished entirely, and horses were found standing frozen mid-stride, still hitched to their wagons. Telegraph poles leaned like wilted stems. The city's proud brownstones looked like half-buried fortresses, their rooftops glinting with thick, glassy ice. One peculiar recollection from a baker on 6th Avenue tells of hearing bells ringing somewhere below him. When the snow finally melted days later, he discovered it had been a milk wagon trapped beneath the drift, the horse still harnessed. The driver crouched beside it, both encased in frost. The image stayed with him for life. The historical community hasn't settled the question of how long the heaviest snowfall lasted that day. Some meteorologists claim it was 36 hours of uninterrupted fury, while others insist there were brief lulls, deceptive moments when people stepped outside only to be caught in the next surge. Regardless, the city had become a frozen labyrinth, the streets indistinguishable from the rooftops. You decide to open the back door again, determined to see daylight. The handle is buried, but after some effort you manage to push it open a few inches. Blinding light floods the room. The air bites instantly, cutting through every layer you wear. The snow wall outside gleams like marble, smooth and immense. You touch it, and it crumbles under your fingers like cold sand. For a moment, the beauty of it almost overwhelms you. You hear voices now, faint and distorted. A man shouting, then laughter, then silence again. The sound carries strangely in the snow, as if the world is wrapped in cotton. You step back and close the door. The room feels warmer by comparison. Letters written years later recall how citizens improvised strange new methods to survive. Some strung ropes from one doorway to another to guide travelers through the whiteout. Others built ladders from broken furniture to climb out of second-story windows. It became, in effect, a new kind of city, vertical instead of horizontal, with streets buried and life continuing somewhere above. A curious note from an old journal describes a policeman who used a stovepipe as a speaking tube to communicate with neighbors next door. He called it his frozen telegraph. They traded small comforts through it: news, advice, the occasional joke. The idea sounds absurd, but humor was another form of heat that week. There's no doubt, based on period records, that the storm revealed how fragile modern life really was. New York prided itself on progress, but the blizzard stripped away every illusion of control. Trains, ferries, telegrams, markets, all reduced to silence. For once, money couldn't move the world. Survival depended instead on the kindness of whoever lived closest. You picture the men who worked at the telegraph offices, sitting in their coats and gloves, staring at dead wires. Maybe they tapped out practice messages to no one, just to remember the rhythm. The stillness must have been unbearable. One odd fragment of oral history mentions a woman who painted her windows black to keep out the glare from the snow. She said it was like living on the moon. That phrase appears in several letters from the time, as if everyone had agreed that the city had been transported somewhere alien and airless. Some modern researchers argue that the silence of those buried days changed New York's relationship with noise forever. After the blizzard, the city's roar seemed louder, more precious, as if people had discovered that sound itself was proof of life. Even now, if you stand in a snowstorm, you might notice how your heartbeat feels like the only pulse that matters. You spend the afternoon sitting close to the stove, wrapping your hands around a cup of thin soup. The warmth spreads slowly. You listen for footsteps again, half hoping to hear rescue crews digging nearby. The idea of human voices feels like a luxury now. Outside, the storm has turned the world into sculpture. Fences curve under weight, signs tilt at strange angles, and trees stand coated in crystal armor. Somewhere beneath that frozen beauty lies destruction, but you can't see it. You only see white upon white, endless, unbroken. According to letters found decades later, many survivors described a peculiar peace that settled in after fear ran out. They stopped worrying about what might happen and simply existed, hour to hour, tending fires, melting snow, waiting. Perhaps that is what survival often becomes, not heroism, just patience. You close your eyes and imagine the city from above, roofs like islands, smoke curling from a few stubborn chimneys, the harbour locked in ice, every street name, every familiar landmark erased. The thought feels strangely comforting, as if nature has pressed a pause button on the entire world. A faint tapping pulls you back to the present. It comes from the wall again, 2 knocks, then 3. You answer with 2. The pattern feels like friendship. Whoever is there, they're alive, and that's enough. Even as you sit surrounded by frost and silence, you can sense the storm beginning to wane. The wind has softened slightly, its roar shifting into a long sigh. Somewhere above the clouds, sunlight must exist, waiting to return. You can almost feel it, faint as a promise. By the time you wake again, something has changed in the air. The silence is deeper, thicker, but no longer hostile. You sense it before you even open your eyes. The wind is gone. The stillness that replaces it feels powerful, like the city is holding its breath. You sit up slowly, every muscle stiff from sleeping on the floor. The stove has gone cold again, but the faintest shimmer of light filters through the frost on the window. You crawl to it and press your palm against the ice. For the first time in days, the glass glows with sunlight. You manage to push the window open a few inches, and a rush of cold air fills the room. Outside, the world is unrecognizable. The streets are gone, replaced by white hills that rise and fall like dunes. Roofs glint in the distance, and chimneys puff weak curls of smoke. The city has turned into a frozen archipelago, every home its own island. You can't see the street level at all. Somewhere below that gleaming surface lie wagons, fences, and doorways buried under 15-foot drifts. According to the reports that survived, rural New England fared even worse. In Connecticut, barns disappeared completely under the snow, only their weather vanes left poking through. Farmers dug tunnels to reach their livestock, crawling through icy corridors with lanterns held in their teeth. In Massachusetts, trains froze mid-route, their passengers huddling together inside cars that had become rolling prisons. It was as though the countryside had been swallowed whole. A peculiar story from Vermont tells of a man who tunneled his way to his neighbor's barn using nothing but a cast-iron skillet. When he finally reached the other side, he found the neighbor sitting on a hay bale, calmly smoking a pipe. They supposedly shared a drink in silence before crawling back to their respective prisons. Whether the story is true or not hardly matters. It has been passed down in families for generations, the kind of tale that keeps ancestors alive. Researchers who studied the blizzard's impact still disagree about which region suffered most. Some point to the city, where population density made disaster swift and merciless. Others argue that the rural poor bore the heavier burden, their isolation turning days into weeks of peril. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. The storm didn't discriminate. It simply took what it could reach. You picture those farmers, their breath clouding in dark barns, trying to keep animals alive with feed frozen solid. Somewhere in upstate New York, a family uses the last of its lamp oil to thaw a pump handle, desperate for water. The sound of axes striking ice echoes across valleys like slow, steady drums. It is not the rhythm of panic anymore, but of endurance. What the historical accounts all agree on is the depth of the snow. In some places, drifts measured over 50 inches. In others, the wind carved sheer walls higher than doorways. One farmer wrote that he walked across the top of his orchard without touching the ground. The apple trees slept below him, their branches buried, their roots safe but silent. Oddly enough, in several diaries from the countryside, people describe how beautiful the landscape became once the sky cleared. The sun turned the snow into a sheet of diamonds. Every breath released tiny crystals into the air. The silence was so complete that the ticking of a clock could be heard through walls. After days of violence, the world looked clean again, untouched. You step outside onto your own small balcony, snow-packed waist-high against the rail. The light is almost blinding. The air smells sharp, clean, and faintly of smoke from distant fires. Somewhere, faintly, you hear laughter. The sound surprises you. It's been days since anything human pierced the storm's silence. Records indicate that when the wind finally stopped, thousands of people across New York opened their doors simultaneously, blinking like moles in sunlight. They found their streets gone, their neighbors' houses nearly level with their own rooftops. Some cheered, others simply cried from relief. The first thing many did was call out names, testing to see who would answer. A small note in a survivor's journal mentions that people quickly began to carve tunnels between houses, forming makeshift streets under the snow. Families shared food and stories underground. Some even used sleds to send messages from one buried home to another. It sounds almost festive, but it was survival dressed up as community. Experts later proposed that this spontaneous cooperation saved countless lives. In neighborhoods where people worked together to clear vents and share heat, fewer deaths were recorded. Where neighbors stayed isolated, tragedy followed. It's a reminder that human warmth is its own kind of shelter. You look out again, watching the way the sunlight glitters off the frozen world. Somewhere beneath the surface, you know the bodies of animals, and perhaps people lie still. Yet from this vantage, everything feels peaceful. The city appears asleep, waiting to be uncovered. There's a strange optimism in that thought. Perhaps that's why so many survivors wrote afterward not only of fear but of awe. The storm had revealed something primal, a truth buried beneath the noise of progress. They had glimpsed the smallness of human effort against the vastness of nature and survived to tell of it. Letters recovered from the time mention the smell of thawing hay, the sound of roosters crowing as if nothing had happened, the sight of children climbing snowy domes that hid their own front doors. Life, somehow, insisted on continuing. A curious observation appears in a farmer's diary from New Hampshire. When the snow stopped, I could hear my heart louder than the wind. That line lingers, both poetic and practical. It's the sentence of someone who has lived through too much quiet. The city remains still beneath you, smoke curling upward like thin strings into the blue. The storm is finally over, though the real work of survival is only beginning. Roads must be dug, fires rekindled, people found. The sun feels gentle now, touching everything with a forgiving hand. You stay by the window a little longer, letting the light soak into your face. The air is bright, the snow dazzling, the silence heavy but no longer cruel. The storm may have passed, but its memory clings to every frozen surface, a white echo that will take weeks to melt away. You wake to sunlight, real sunlight this time, pouring through the cracks in the curtains. The first thing you notice is the quiet drip of melting snow. Each droplet falls like a tiny metronome, steady, almost musical. The world that tried to crush you only yesterday now seems to be softening its hold. You move toward the window, brushing aside the frost with your sleeve. Outside, the city looks dazed. Roofs sparkle with ice, and long spears of icicles hang from every ledge. You push the window open wider and breathe in the cold air. It smells of salt, soot, and thawing wood. Somewhere a pigeon coos, a small miracle of survival. The storm is done, but its grip remains. The snowbanks are higher than carriages, higher even than door frames. You can see people emerging like explorers onto the roofs of their own homes, waving to neighbors who are just as astonished to be alive. Contemporary reports describe how the telegraph lines were dead, the railroads frozen, and all communication lost. New York City, usually a nerve center of chatter and trade, was cut off entirely. Some historians suggest this was the first time since the telegraph's invention that Manhattan was completely isolated. For 2 long days, the city didn't just sleep, it ceased to exist in the national conversation. One odd but charming detail from the period says that a few resourceful editors tried to restart their newspapers by hand-delivering handwritten sheets to nearby districts. They printed them with toy presses or scribbled updates on scraps of paper. It didn't matter that the information was old or guessed. People just needed words again, a sign that life was continuing. Experts still debate which moment marked the true end of the Great Blizzard. Was it when the last snowflake fell, or when the first message traveled along a repaired wire? Maybe it ended only when the people themselves decided it was over. After all, history doesn't stop with the weather. It stops when we stop fearing it. You light the stove again, the fire sputtering but finally catching. The warmth feels like luxury now, like winning something precious. You pour the last of your tea and sip slowly, watching the way the steam swirls into the air. Outside, voices begin to multiply. Someone shouts directions, another calls for help. A distant laugh floats upward. It's the sound of a city remembering itself. According to letters later published in small-town papers, families trapped in the countryside began digging their way out around this time. Some took days just to reach the next house. In places, fences had disappeared entirely, so travelers moved by guesswork, following the tops of hedgerows or church steeples poking through snow. A few even claimed that crows guided them, circling above the buried roads like black markers in a sea of white. One peculiar record from Rhode Island tells of a minister who held Sunday service in a barn because the church door couldn't be found. He stood on a haystack while the congregation sat on upturned buckets. They sang softly, their breath rising like incense in the frigid air. The hymn they chose was "Abide with Me." It must have sounded fragile and magnificent all at once. Researchers later pointed out that the blizzard destroyed much of the telegraph infrastructure that connected cities along the coast. In doing so, it exposed the fragility of progress. But it also inspired something new. Within a year, engineers began to bury telegraph cables underground, shielding them from the next great storm. The blizzard, in its cruelty, had become a teacher. A letter from a Brooklyn schoolteacher captures the human side of that moment. "We found each other by voice," she wrote, "calling through the drifts." The children laughed as we tunneled from window to window, and for a while, it felt like the world was kind. Her words remind you that even in disaster, people search for tenderness. You imagine how the city must look from above, the skyline hidden beneath uneven ridges, the harbor sealed with ice, the East River glittering like glass. The silence has changed tone now. It feels watchful, expectant. Somewhere beneath those snow mounds are streets waiting to be rediscovered. There's a knock at your door, faint but real. You answer, and for the first time in days, you see another human face. It's your neighbor, wrapped in a quilt, cheeks flushed red from cold. He smiles through chapped lips and says he's checking who's still breathing. You exchange small talk, clumsy but full of relief. He has a bit of bread. You have tea. You share both, laughing at how grand the meal feels. A well-documented fact from later surveys is that many city dwellers forged lasting friendships during the blizzard. People who had never spoken before shared warmth and food, kept each other alive, and continued visiting long after the thaw. It was as if the snow had stripped away all the usual layers of distance and pride. A curious anecdote from uptown tells of a group of musicians stranded in a boarding house who decided to pass the time by performing nightly concerts for their neighbors. They played violin and piano, their music echoing through frozen halls. One listener described it as the first sound of spring. The days of isolation begin to merge in your mind. Time feels strange, each moment stretching and folding back on itself. You mark the hours by the sun's slow crawl across the walls. Outside, the thaw continues. Snow shifts and settles, collapsing in slow motion. You hear the distant clink of shovels, a rhythm of renewal. You wrap your coat tighter, step closer to the window, and look down at the endless glitter of the city. Somewhere beneath it all, telegraph lines lie broken and silent. But soon they will hum again, carrying voices across distance, stitching the world back together. For now, though, you just listen to the dripping water and the faint, hopeful murmur of life beginning again. The next morning dawns pale and bright, sunlight glancing off the snow like a mirror held to your face. The air is still, the kind of stillness that comes after exhaustion. You wake to the smell of cold iron, wood smoke, and something else bread. Someone nearby is baking again. That small scent feels like a promise. You dress quickly, layer upon layer, your hands stiff from the chill. When you open the door, a solid wall of snow greets you. You laugh softly, because it's almost comical now. You push with your shoulder, dig with a pan, and eventually carve out a small gap that lets in the day. The light is dazzling, a flood of white that fills the hallway. The quiet outside has a strange hum to it, as though the world is holding a low, steady note. According to city records, rescue efforts began in earnest this morning. Police officers, firemen, and volunteers formed groups to dig out the main streets. They used whatever tools they could find: shovels, boards, even pots. In some neighborhoods, people passed buckets of snow hand to hand, clearing paths one body length at a time. The streets began to appear again, dark tunnels of slush carved through the glittering mounds. A lesser-known observation from a local newspaper described the way people started to organize food stations inside churches and schools. Many of these buildings had become refuges during the storm, and now they served as kitchens and meeting points. Children were fed first, their laughter echoing through stone walls that had heard nothing but wind for days. Scholars still discuss how this improvised cooperation reflected the character of late 19th century America. Some claim it revealed a new urban solidarity born from necessity. Others argue it merely showed how fragile individualism becomes when the streets vanish. You can see the truth of both sides in the faces you pass. Strangers nodding to one another, no longer pretending they live separate lives. You step outside at last, blinking against the glare. The snow is higher than your waist, but it has hardened overnight, forming ridges strong enough to walk on. You move carefully, every crunch underfoot echoing like a heartbeat. The sound of distant shovels, the murmur of voices, the occasional bark of a dog. These are the city's first fragile sounds of resurrection. One recorded fact from that day tells how the Metropolitan Museum opened its doors to anyone seeking shelter. Families slept among statues and paintings, their breath clouding the air. A curator wrote that he woke to find a child sitting at the foot of a marble Apollo, whispering, "You look cold too." The image stayed with him for the rest of his life. Another curious story comes from a church on the Lower East Side. The pastor and his wife turned the sanctuary into a soup kitchen, feeding hundreds with whatever they could find: beans, barley, potatoes left half frozen in cellars. Someone played hymns on an out-of-tune organ, and the sound mingled with the scraping of spoons. Survival can have its own rhythm. Researchers later noted that people began to invent small systems of order amid the chaos. Snow tunnels were labeled with chalk marks to guide the lost. Makeshift ladders connected second floors between buildings. Messages were written on scraps of paper and placed in bottles, dropped through the snow to the ground level where someone might find them. It was a vertical society, layered like the snow itself. A strange yet moving account from a teacher's diary describes her students sleeping in the classroom through the worst nights. They used textbooks for pillows, and one little boy drew a map of Snowland, marking each child's desk as a city. She kept that map for years, calling it proof that children always find geography, even in disaster. The debate among historians about the emotional toll of those days remains unresolved. Some suggest people felt an almost spiritual calm after the chaos, a sense that time had stopped for reflection. Others argue the quiet masked trauma, the beginning of sleepless nights and fears of being trapped again. The truth is probably both. Survival often hides its scars beneath politeness. By afternoon, you join a group of neighbors clearing snow from a nearby intersection. The work feels good, the effort grounding after days of stillness. Everyone's breath rises in plumes, merging into a shared mist. You recognize faces you've seen for years but never spoken to until now. Disaster makes quick introductions. According to the city council minutes written weeks later, the first official communication lines to be restored were between police precincts. They used runners, young men darting through the half-cleared streets, wrapped in scarves, carrying notes inside tin cans. Each delivery meant a tiny victory, a pulse returning to a frozen body. A peculiar recollection from a child who survived recalls her mother baking biscuits on the stove's iron plate while snow still blocked the door. She said the smell filled the house and made her believe the storm could be eaten away one bite at a time. The phrase, eating the snow, would later become part of local law. You pause to rest, leaning on your shovel, and look down the long corridor of snow you've helped carve. The sun flashes off every surface, dazzling and cruel. Yet under the brightness, you feel something shift, hope, fragile but undeniable. That night, the city glows softly. Candles flicker in windows, and faint smoke curls from chimneys. For the first time since the blizzard began, you hear footsteps passing outside, steady and unhurried. The storm's voice is gone. In its place are human sounds again, breathing, laughter, the scrape of boots on ice. You lie by the stove later, your body aching from work but your heart lighter than it has been in days. The snow still towers outside, but now it feels temporary, something that can be moved, melted, conquered inch by inch. You close your eyes to the soft crackle of fire and drift into sleep, the echo of shovels fading into dreams of spring. Morning comes with the sound of shovels, metal against ice, wood against stone. You wake to that rhythm, steady as breathing, and for a moment you just listen. It's strange how comforting noise can be after silence. The blizzard has passed, but now the city must free itself. You stretch stiffly, your muscles sore from the cold and from the digging yesterday. When you push open the door, the sunlight is brighter, the air less cruel. The street outside looks like a battlefield of white mounds and narrow trenches. Men, women and children work side by side, scooping, hauling, laughing even when their hands freeze. Every now and then, someone shouts a greeting through the walls of snow. It feels like a festival of exhaustion. You take up a shovel and join them, the weight of it grounding you. Each lift of snow a small act of defiance. Eyewitness records describe how strangers began forming human chains to reach those still trapped. Ropes were tied around waists, people linked hands, and they advanced slowly through the drifts. Many rescues depended on sound more than sight. A faint cry or the bark of a dog could mean a life waiting beneath the surface. They called out names again and again, their voices swallowed by snow until one answered. One rare letter preserved from that week tells of a group of workers in Manhattan who saved a family by following the smell of kerosene leaking from a buried lamp. When they found the door, they had to dig down 10 feet. The family inside had run out of air just as the rescuers broke through. The letter ends simply, "We breathe together." Researchers who study disasters often point to this blizzard as one of the earliest examples of organized urban rescue efforts. Before it, most people relied on neighbors or luck. After it, cities began to train police and fire brigades for large-scale emergencies. Out of the snow grew the first seeds of coordinated public safety. A curious account from a schoolteacher mentions that even the children helped. They were small enough to crawl through narrow passages adults couldn't fit in. She wrote that one boy, only 10, carried warm bread to a house across the street by wriggling through a snow tunnel on his belly. He returned with a grin and frost on his eyelashes. The academic world still wrestles with the question of how people balanced fear and cooperation in those days. Some sociologists describe it as a spontaneous return to communal instinct, while others think it was simply necessity. You can feel both in the air around you now. Every shovel, every rope, every hand extended is a conversation between desperation and hope. The work continues all day. You dig, haul, and sweat despite the freezing air. Now and then someone passes a tin cup of coffee or a scrap of bread. The smell of burning coal drifts through the tunnels where windows are finally reopening. A city of half-buried roofs begins to reappear. According to a police report written later, rescuers found more than 200 people alive in buried homes or cellars during that single day. Some were dazed, some weeping, some simply too tired to react. They were carried out in blankets, blinking at the light, and given water that steamed as it touched their lips. One odd detail from an engineer's journal tells how the city's elevated rail lines turned into rescue bridges. Workers used the tracks above the streets to spot collapsed roofs and guide diggers below. It was an improvised system, but it worked. The railways that had failed as transport became the city's eyes. You pause for a moment, leaning on your shovel, and look down the narrow corridor of snow you've helped carve. The walls glimmer blue in the shade, white where the sun touches them. A group of children run past, their laughter echoing strangely between the drifts. Someone starts singing an old sea shanty, and others join in without knowing the words. It's a well-documented fact that day marked a turning point in morale. The city, though still buried, began to feel alive again. Food supplies were found, wells unsealed, and telegraph lines partially restored. The first real message sent after the storm was a simple one: we are still here. A peculiar recollection survives from a Boston newspaper editor who claimed he saw people shaking hands with complete strangers after clearing a single path. They looked as if they had defeated an army, he wrote. Perhaps they had. Evening falls slowly. You can hear water dripping now, a sure sign of the coming thaw. Smoke curls from chimneys again, and light glows behind windows newly freed from ice. You stand in the snow trench, shoulders aching, heart steady. Around you, voices rise in tired celebration. Someone cheers as another roof emerges from the white. No one mentions the dead tonight. Not yet. For now, it's enough to feel life returning, to hear laughter echo down the narrow corridors of survival. You climb back inside, your boots soaked, your hands blistered, but your chest warm. The stove greets you like an old friend, its orange light flickering softly against the walls. You sit down, exhausted, and stare out the window. The sky is streaked with pink and gold, the city still half asleep beneath its burden. You sip the last of your tea and listen to the muffled voices fading into distance. Above it all, a single church bell rings, slow and deliberate, marking the end of a day that felt like rebirth. By morning, the digging has become an orchestra. You wake to the scraping of shovels, the thud of snow hitting ground, the rhythmic calls of workers coordinating their efforts. The city has found its rhythm again, not of traffic or commerce, but of survival. The air smells of wet metal and ash. You open your window and a gust of crisp air rushes in, stinging your skin and clearing your thoughts. Outside, the world looks carved. People have tunneled through snow so high that the streets resemble white-walled canyons. You climb down a ladder into what used to be the avenue. The light filters oddly, bright above but dim below, like being underwater. Every few steps, someone has cut a doorway through the drift, leading into a buried shop or home. You can hear voices from within, muffled but alive. Contemporary reports describe these makeshift passages as snow tunnels. They wound through entire blocks, connecting houses, stores, and churches. Citizens decorated their tunnel entrances with scraps of fabric or painted signs, calling them things like Broadway Alley or Frost Street. It became, for a few days, a city beneath a city. One forgotten anecdote from a carpenter's diary tells of him carving a tunnel high enough for a wagon to pass through, using only a handsaw and a kitchen ladle. When asked why he bothered, he supposedly replied, "Because the world has to keep moving, even when you can't see it." His tunnel became a neighborhood landmark until the spring thaw erased it completely. Meteorological records from the era confirm that the snow reached record depths, in some areas piled by wind to more than 50 inches. But what the numbers cannot capture is how quiet those tunnels were. Survivors later wrote that you could hear every sound: boots crunching, breath echoing, even the whisper of a shovel cutting through frost. A smaller story hides within the grand history. A woman running a bakery reopened by digging straight into her shop from above, cutting a narrow staircase of snow. She sold bread through a window frame turned sideways, and the smell drifted down the tunnel like salvation. Many remembered that scent as the moment the city began to feel human again. Experts today still debate how long it took to clear those subterranean streets. Some estimates say a week, others 2. The discrepancy matters less than the image itself. Thousands of people crawling, digging, and laughing their way back to daylight. You join the workers, your breath steaming in the cold. The snow feels heavier now, waterlogged from the sun. It clings to the shovel and slides in thick slabs. The men beside you joke about charging admission to their ice hotel. Someone starts singing, and soon half the trench joins in. Laughter rolls upward, carried by the acoustics of snow. According to later surveys, a surprising number of people refused to leave their tunnels even after the main roads were cleared. They had grown accustomed to the safety and community they offered. It was said that some children cried when their icy play corridors finally melted. A curious note from an artist's memoir mentions that he painted portraits of the tunnels in candlelight, fascinated by how the walls glowed blue and silver. He wrote that the city seemed reborn underground, gentler, closer, more forgiving. His paintings, though long lost, are often described in exhibition catalogues as the first depictions of urban intimacy born of catastrophe. You stop to rest at a junction where 2 tunnels meet. Someone has built a lantern post from a broomstick and a glass jar filled with tallow. The faint flame trembles, its glow touching the snow walls like liquid gold. You feel the air shift warmer, quieter, almost tender. For the first time in days, you forget fear. Later accounts confirm that these tunnels saved lives not just by providing shelter but by fostering communication. When you can't see the horizon, the next face becomes your entire world. Neighbors traded stories, songs, and bits of food through small holes carved between rooms. The city became a single, breathing organism. One small letter written by a young woman to her sister survives in a museum archive. It reads, "We live beneath the snow now. It's quiet, and we're all together. Sometimes I think the world above has gone away, but then I hear a laugh through the wall, and I know we're still here." It's a simple sentence, but it carries all the weight of that frozen time. A peculiar rumor from the Uptown district claims that a group of men carved their tunnel so precisely that it led straight into a pub. When they opened the door, the patrons inside cheered and offered them ale served in tin mugs packed with ice. Whether true or not, it fits perfectly with the spirit of those days, hard work rewarded by small joy. As the day wanes, the tunnels begin to melt slightly. Water trickles down the walls, glinting like threads of glass. The light outside dims to gold, reflecting through the narrow corridors. You climb back up to your room and look down at the maze of paths you helped uncover. From above, it looks like veins of light running through the city's frozen heart. Historians later wrote that the tunnels of 1888 were both tragedy and triumph, symbols of loss and ingenuity. The snow that trapped the city also forced it to rediscover cooperation. You think of that now, watching figures move below, tiny against the vast white mounds, yet strong enough to reshape them. Night falls quietly. You light your candle, listening to the muffled footsteps fading under the snow. The world above and below feels balanced for once, peaceful in its imperfection. You fall asleep to the sound of dripping water and distant laughter echoing through the tunnels of survival. The air has softened by the time you wake again. The sound of the shovels is still there, but it has moved farther away, as if the city is digging its way back to you. When you open the door, a shaft of light cuts through the cold, scattering tiny prisms across the snow tunnel outside. The air smells faintly of wet stone and ash, but also of something new melting. You climb up onto the nearest drift and look down the avenue. What used to be a silent labyrinth is now alive with movement. Men dig, women carry water, children haul chunks of ice like treasure. Every few yards, someone has raised a flag or a cloth over a doorway to mark a cleared entrance. The city is learning to stand again. It's a well-recorded fact that the railways had not yet returned to service by this morning. Trains remained stranded across the northeast, their cars half buried in snow, their passengers slowly running out of coal for heat. Some survivors later wrote that the silence inside those cars was worse than the storm itself. "We could not move," one man recalled. "We could only listen to the snow piling higher." A curious account from a telegraph operator tells how, in desperation, some passengers tore up the wooden benches inside their train to keep warm. They fed the fragments into the small iron stove used for tea, and for a time, the smell of scorched varnish mingled with the scent of freezing steel. The image feels both tragic and practical, an odd testament to human stubbornness. Meteorologists of the time believed the storm had ended completely by now, but the wind had other ideas. Gusts still swept through the open plains, driving snow into deep cuts and burying the stalled locomotives even deeper. It would take days for the tracks to be cleared, and even longer for the schedules to resume. Modern researchers still disagree about the total number of trains trapped by the blizzard. Some records list 24, others nearly 50. You imagine being one of those passengers, sealed inside a motionless carriage surrounded by frozen white silence. The lamps burn low, the air grows thin, and the windows frost over until even the moonlight disappears. Someone plays a harmonica, its notes trembling against the cold. That fragile music might be the only proof that you're still alive. According to reports gathered later by the rail companies, passengers learned to ration what they had. Conductors organized shifts to keep the small stoves burning, and people took turns sleeping near them. Children were wrapped in coats that didn't belong to them. Food was shared. Strangers became family for 3 long days. The blizzard turned ordinary travelers into small, temporary communities sealed inside iron shells. One letter from a woman trapped near Albany describes a surreal calm that came over everyone. "After the second day, we stopped expecting rescue," she wrote. "We drank melted snow, told stories, and waited. It was like living inside a clock that had stopped ticking." A particularly unusual report tells of a mail train whose crew refused to abandon their cargo. They built a campfire beside the locomotive and guarded the letters as if they were gold. When rescuers finally reached them, the sacks of mail were dry, though their fingers were not. Some of those letters were later found, still sealed, their ink unfaded, a quiet archive of hope that never reached its destinations. It is remarkable how many small decisions of kindness survived those days. In one case, a farmer living near the tracks used his oxen to drag food to a stranded passenger train. He tied the parcels to a sled and guided the animals by lantern light through blinding snow. When the passengers later wrote their accounts, they couldn't agree on his name, but every one of them remembered the glow of his lantern. Even now, historians wonder whether the railroad companies learned as much as the people did. Within months, there were calls for better communication systems, insulated wires, and stronger locomotives. Some say the blizzard forced the birth of modern winter preparedness. Others believe it was forgotten too quickly, buried like everything else beneath the snow. Back in your city, the railway stations stand eerily quiet. The great iron arches drip with thawing frost, their platforms littered with frozen footprints. Pigeons perch on rafters, silent witnesses to a halted world. You walk through what feels like the skeleton of motion, and the echo of your footsteps is the only sound. A diary found decades later from a railway engineer describes that sight vividly. It was as if time had left us behind, the engines staring at nothing, their mouths full of snow. That single line captures what no statistic could: the strange dignity of stillness. You leave the station and step into the open air again. The sun is brighter now, the light bouncing hard off every surface. Steam rises from rooftops where fires burn again. Somewhere in the distance, you hear a faint whistle. It could be a signal, or maybe just the wind. Either way, it carries a kind of promise. By afternoon, the tunnels you helped carve yesterday have widened. They resemble streets again, though the walls of snow remain high on both sides. People move more easily now. They carry pails of water, bundles of food, even flowers salvaged from frozen gardens. The smell of life is returning: yeast, smoke, and faintly, thawing earth. A journalist writing in one of the first post-storm editions called this moment the Great Breath. It was as if the entire Northeast inhaled together after days of holding still. You feel it too, standing there among the dripping ice and sunlight. Every drop that falls is a note in the song of recovery. That night, as you lie near the stove, you picture the stranded trains slowly being uncovered, their passengers blinking in the pale light of rescue. You imagine the telegraph wires humming back to life, messages crackling again through the cold air. The storm's story is far from over, but already it is being told. The next day begins with the scent of salt and smoke. You wake to a faint booming sound that makes the window tremble. For a moment you think it might be thunder, but then you remember the harbour. The tide has returned, and with it, the sea is reclaiming its place at the edge of the frozen city. You pull on your coat and step outside, climbing over the drifts toward the waterfront. The streets near the river look like the edge of another planet. The East River is frozen solid in parts, the ice stretching far into the distance like a pale road. Ships lie trapped within it, their masts jutting out of the frost like spears. Sailors move slowly across the decks, bundled in layers, knocking ice from ropes with iron rods. The air stings with salt and the smell of tar, and beneath it all there's the deep groan of water struggling to breathe. Records from the Coastal Watch confirm that dozens of ships were caught offshore during the height of the storm. Some never made it to port. The blizzard didn't only bury cities, it devoured the sea as well. Ships froze in place, their sails torn and their hulls creaking under the weight of ice. Captains dropped anchors and prayed. A small but haunting report in a maritime log tells of the schooner Mary Ann, last seen off Long Island before the storm hit. It was later found half submerged, her deck sheathed in frozen spray, her crew locked in place by the cold. The logbook was still dry inside the cabin, its final entry reading, "Winds rising fast, snow thicker than smoke." The handwriting trails off mid-sentence. Researchers who study maritime weather still argue about how the Great Blizzard's winds interacted with the tides that week. Some claim the cold front caused a sudden pressure shift that froze the harbour faster than anyone thought possible. Others think the snow simply fell faster than the waves could move it aside. The truth may be a mixture of both. You make your way along the docks, watching workers hack at the ice with picks. Every strike echoes across the frozen bay. They are freeing ships one by one, though the process is painfully slow. A group of men pull ropes taut, chanting together as they try to turn a stranded ferry. Their voices carry through the still air, a sound of determination rather than despair. One peculiar story, preserved by a sailor's family, tells of a man who lit fires on the deck of his ship to melt the ice around it. He used barrels of whale oil scavenged from a nearby warehouse. The plan worked long enough for the vessel to shift a few feet before the flames caught the rigging. The ship burned slowly for hours, its glow reflecting off the ice like a floating sunset. The sailors nearby watched in silence. According to newspaper accounts, The ferries that once connected Manhattan and Brooklyn were destroyed or stranded. Their ropes snapped and their decks splintered. Many of those caught mid-crossing spent 2 nights trapped in the frozen river, huddled together under blankets. They burned crates, railings, anything wooden, to stay alive. When rescuers finally reached them, some were still clutching teacups frozen to their hands. A well-known marine engineer wrote afterward that the blizzard marked the end of the city's reliance on ferries. It wasn't long before plans for bridges and elevated railways began to take shape, driven by the memory of those trapped at sea. The blizzard didn't only change weather records, it changed how people imagined movement itself. You stand now at the edge of the harbour, watching men cut channels through the ice to reach the remaining vessels. The sound of their axes mingles with the creaking of hulls. The sunlight catches on shards of broken ice, scattering reflections across the surface like shattered glass. For the first time in days, you can smell the sea again, alive and moving beneath its frozen skin. A sailor sitting nearby tells you that a few fishing boats from New Jersey washed up along the coast miles from where they left port. He laughs softly, saying the ocean had wandered too far inland. His beard is thick with frost, his eyes bright. You nod, unsure what else to say. It's the kind of joke that hides exhaustion. Contemporary observers noted that the cleanup at the docks was among the hardest tasks after the blizzard. The ice had crushed piers, broken cranes, and shattered cargo holds. Whale oil, coal, and flour froze solid in barrels, forming useless blocks. Ships that survived were stranded for weeks before they could move again. The harbour, once the lifeline of trade, had become a frozen museum of stillness. And yet, amid all this destruction, life persisted. Seagulls circled above the wrecks, their cries sharp and defiant. Fishermen began to gather at the edges of the ice, chipping small holes to test its thickness. Somewhere, a child threw a stone and laughed as it skittered across the frozen surface before disappearing into a crack. A small, overlooked note from a city inspector's diary mentions that one barge, trapped near the battery, became a floating shelter. Families who had lost their homes in the storm climbed aboard, lighting fires in metal drums and hanging blankets as walls. He wrote that their laughter drifted across the ice at night like songs from another world. Experts today often say that this was the moment when New Yorkers rediscovered the power of the sea, not just its danger, but its resilience. The harbour would later be dredged, rebuilt, and refitted with new safety measures. But for a brief time it was a white desert holding secrets in its depths. You turn away from the water as the sun begins to fade. The wind has softened, carrying the smell of thawing seaweed and smoke. Behind you, the workers keep swinging their axes, their silhouettes dark against the glittering horizon. The sound follows you back through the snow tunnels, like a heartbeat, steady, human, alive. That night, as you rest beside the stove, you picture the harbour thawing inch by inch, the ships breaking free one after another. Somewhere out there, the Mary Ann lies beneath the ice, her story preserved in silence. You close your eyes to the rhythm of dripping water and distant hammers, the sea's slow return to life. The morning light falls soft and blue through the thinning frost. You wake to the smell of bread again, and for a moment, you think it might be a dream. Then a knock at the door proves otherwise. Your neighbour stands there, cheeks red, scarf crusted with snow, holding a loaf wrapped in paper. He grins, teeth chattering, and says there's warmth in the bakery on the corner. You follow him without a word. Outside, the streets have widened. The tunnels of snow now feel like shallow ditches, and above them the sun shines cold and clear. Steam rises from chimneys, melting the edges of roofs. Everywhere, people are clearing, patching, building again. But in the midst of all this movement, there is something gentler happening too. Stories are being told. It's a certainty in the records that when the worst of the storm had passed, the city's shelters overflowed. Churches, schools, and firehouses became havens. Inside them, people huddled on straw mats or pews, wrapped in borrowed blankets, and passed the hours by sharing what they had seen. The Great Blizzard wasn't just an event anymore. It had already begun to turn into legend. A smaller, more intimate account from a seamstress recalls sitting in a chapel near Gramercy Park, watching the snow glow blue through the stained glass windows. She wrote that a man beside her began telling a story about how he survived the night in a horse stable with two strangers and a bottle of gin. The story grew with every retelling, until even the children were laughing. It was warmth made of words, she wrote. Researchers today often point to these shared stories as the first moments of collective healing after the storm. When people could not yet rebuild, they remembered. In that remembering, they built something invisible but stronger than brick. One peculiar tale from an Upper Manhattan shelter mentions a group of strangers who started a contest to see who could tell the most unbelievable blizzard story. A carpenter claimed he saw a cat frozen mid-leap. A nurse swore she'd delivered a baby in a bakery oven for warmth. The winner, according to the note in the margin, was a man who said he had seen an entire tree lifted from the ground and carried away like a ghost. Among the official reports written later, there is a quiet observation from a city clerk who visited the shelters. "They speak softly," he wrote. "It is as if the storm took their loudness." That sentence seems small, but it reveals something larger, that even in survival, people felt the hush of what they'd witnessed. A newspaper printed a poem the following week, unsigned, describing the storm as a giant that came to teach the proud their size. The writer's name has been lost, but the poem was reprinted in towns all across the Northeast. It reminded people that what they had endured wasn't just a tragedy, it was a shared moment of humility before nature's vastness. In one of the shelters near City Hall, a young teacher started collecting names and addresses from everyone inside, promising to write a book of memories once the thaw came. Some of those notes still exist in archives today, written in pencil on scraps of paper. A milkman, a widow, a child who drew his house with snow higher than the roof. Curiously, historians have noticed that these personal accounts often focus on small acts of kindness rather than fear. People wrote about being given soup, about neighbors checking on each other, about strangers sharing stories late into the night. It seems that what survived longest from the blizzard wasn't the cold, but the warmth people made in spite of it. A diary belonging to a woman who owned a boarding house near 8th Avenue describes her guests as snowbound philosophers. She wrote that they debated whether the blizzard was punishment, coincidence, or divine humor. Their conclusion, after much laughter, was that it was simply the earth reminding everyone who was in charge. She underlined that sentence twice. There is a charming bit of trivia about a small tavern that became known as the Storm House. Its owner offered free drinks to anyone who could tell a story that made the room laugh. For weeks afterward, people visited just to hear the tales. Years later, when the tavern burned down, the locals rebuilt it and kept the same name. Academics who study folklore say that the Great Blizzard created a kind of urban mythology, a shared narrative that outlived the snow itself. The city had been humbled, but also united by memory. You can feel that unity in the air now. People stop to talk, to compare what they saw, to turn their suffering into something they can understand. You spend the afternoon at the shelter with others, listening. A man with frostbitten hands describes walking through streets that looked like tunnels of moonlight. A woman remembers finding her lost cat asleep in a bread bin. Someone jokes that the snow will be charging rent next. The laughter feels lighter now, easier. Later, as the crowd begins to thin, you step outside. The sun sits low over the city, casting long shadows across the melting drifts. The air smells faintly of yeast, soot, and spring. You close your eyes for a moment, feeling the warmth on your face. Around you, people continue to talk, their voices carrying across the open air like threads stitching the city back together. You walk home slowly, your boots squelching through the slush. The world is noisy again, carts creak, bells ring, and distant hammers tap against wood. Yet underneath it all, there's still that soft, lingering quiet left by the storm. You realize that silence isn't just the absence of sound. Sometimes it's what remains after everything has been said. That night, by the fire, you write down one of the stories you heard, the one about the cat frozen mid-leap. You smile as you finish the line, knowing it might not be true, but understanding that truth is not always what people need first. Sometimes they need a story to make the world gentle again. By dawn, the city smells of smoke and wet earth. The snow is melting faster now, sliding off rooftops in heavy sheets. The streets glisten with icy puddles, and the sound of dripping water has replaced the groan of wind. You wake to a world halfway between ruin and renewal. The first thing you notice when you step outside is the noise of animals. Dogs bark from behind half-buried fences. Horses stamp and snort in the thaw. Pigeons flutter out from rafters where they've taken refuge. For days, the storm silenced every living thing. Now the animals return, hesitant but alive. You feel a strange relief hearing them, as if their presence proves that life itself is thawing. Contemporary reports mention how difficult it was to care for animals during the Great Blizzard. Stable doors froze shut, feed ran out, and horses collapsed in the streets before anyone could reach them. The city's animal population suffered as cruelly as its human one, yet there were acts of quiet heroism everywhere. A stable boy was found days later alive among 10 horses, having refused to abandon them. He'd burned straw for heat and fed the animals by hand. When asked how he survived, he simply said, "They kept me warm." An odd yet touching story from a farmer's journal describes how his cattle survived by breathing against one another, their combined warmth melting small hollows in the snow where they stood. When the family finally dug them out, the animals blinked at the light as if waking from sleep. The farmer wrote, "I had thought them gone, but they had waited for us, patient as saints." Experts in urban history often note that this blizzard marked the first major discussion about humane treatment of work animals in the United States. The sight of frozen horses lining the streets after the storm horrified even the most hardened citizens. Within months, local societies for animal protection gained new members, and public stables were required to provide shelter during extreme weather. The storm, in its brutality, forced empathy to grow. A lesser-known account comes from a woman who worked for a boarding stable near Broadway. She wrote in a letter that she could tell which horses had been cared for and which had been neglected just by the look in their eyes. "Some blinked and leaned toward you," she wrote, "as if they remembered kindness. Others stared through you, already halfway gone." Her words are simple, but they stay with you. Historians remain divided about how many animals died during the Great Blizzard. Some estimates speak of 15,000 horses across the region. Others suggest fewer. The exact number may never be known, because records then treated animals as property, not lives. Yet their absence changed the rhythm of the city. For weeks afterward, transport halted entirely. Bread, coal, and milk deliveries arrived on foot or not at all. There's a peculiar note in a diary kept by a butcher on the Lower East Side. He described stray dogs digging through the snow for scraps and later becoming neighborhood mascots. "They survived as we did," he wrote, "by instinct and by luck." One of those dogs, he claimed, became so beloved that locals built it a small shelter from broken fence boards. You walk down the street now and you can almost see what those days looked like. Horses picking their way over icy cobblestones, wagons creaking with snow-packed wheels, dogs chasing after carts as if life has resumed in slow motion. The city breathes again, though every breath still carries the memory of frost. A small overlooked report from the countryside tells of birds frozen mid-flight, their wings locked open against the sky. It sounds like poetry, but the account came from a schoolteacher's diary. She found them near a fence post, their feathers crusted with ice, their eyes glazed. She wrote that she buried them under a pine tree, so the spring could find them easily. Even as nature struggled, it adapted. Rats tunneled through drifts to reach food stores, and pigeons learned to nest near stovepipes for warmth. Some people swore they saw foxes crossing the frozen East River, though no one could prove it. Myths and memories blur in times like these, yet each tells something about survival. A remarkable letter from an artist in Brooklyn describes how he fed sparrows from his windowsill during the storm. When the snow cleared, the birds returned each morning, tapping on his windowpane until he appeared. He painted them, calling the series Winter Visitors. The paintings are long lost, but his account survives, proof that compassion can outlast disaster. A scientist writing decades later suggested that the Great Blizzard changed how people thought about nature. Before it, the city viewed animals as labor or nuisance. After it, they began to see them as companions in endurance. The storm reminded everyone that survival was shared. You pass a cart where a man is feeding oats to a horse too weak to stand. He strokes its mane gently, murmuring nonsense words just to keep talking. The animal leans its head against his shoulder, eyes closing. There's no sound except the steady crunch of snow beneath your boots and the faint whistle of wind around corners. By afternoon, sunlight turns the melting snow into streams that run down the gutters. Children laugh as they float sticks and scraps of wood in the current, chasing them from one puddle to the next. A black cat leaps from a fence to a rooftop, graceful even in exhaustion. Everything alive seems to be stretching, testing its strength again. Later, as dusk settles, you return home and sit by the window. Outside, you can hear the soft rhythm of hooves, cautious but steady. The city's heartbeat has returned, carried by the animals that endured alongside their keepers. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster crows too early, fooled by the lamplight, and the sound makes you smile. In the fragile calm that follows, you realize the storm has given something back, a tenderness people hadn't known they could feel. They look at the creatures around them and see reflections of themselves. Tired, hungry, but still here. The world isn't healed yet, but it is breathing again. You wake to the sound of boots crunching outside your window. The rhythm is steady and careful, the kind of movement that means people are finally walking freely again. When you open the curtains, sunlight glints off a city transformed. The snow still lies thick, but paths cut clean through it now, like lines in a drawing. Men in heavy coats stride by, and women step carefully across the slush in long skirts. For the first time in what feels like forever, people look less like survivors and more like citizens again. The first thing you notice as you step outside is the color. Gone is the blinding white of the storm. In its place is a soft palette of grey, brown, and silver. Ice drips from eaves like glass beads. The air smells of thawing fabric, wood smoke, and something faintly sweet wool soaked in sunlight. You pull your scarf tighter, still cautious but curious. Contemporary newspapers wrote about this phase of recovery in surprising detail. They called it the city's thawed parade. People emerged from their homes, dressed in whatever had kept them warm through the storm. Some wore layers of blankets, others old coats stitched together with string. In a time before modern winter gear, survival was an art of improvisation. Letters from that week mention how people turned fashion into armor. One woman in Brooklyn wore 2 skirts, 3 shawls, and a curtain tied around her waist for good measure. A man on Fifth Avenue reportedly wrapped his legs in newspaper before stepping outside. He joked that it was the only time news truly saved a life. A lesser-known story from a tailor's diary tells of him creating makeshift snow goggles from tinted glass meant for shop windows. He sold them to street workers who had been blinded by the glare of sunlight on snow. He wrote, "I have never sewn so fast, nor been so thanked." His entry is smudged with soot, as if written beside a fire that refused to die. Scholars today often say the blizzard marked a quiet turning point in clothing design. People learned that fashion could mean the difference between comfort and catastrophe. Thick wool, fur trim, and leather boots became not luxuries but necessities. Stores sold out of mittens and scarves within hours of reopening. For a brief moment, practicality became the city's most admired style. A curious advertisement printed the following month offered storm-tested garments inspired by what people had worn during the blizzard. It promised coats proof against the fury of nature and boots fit for the snows of eternity. The language was dramatic, but the idea caught on. From then on, winter clothing began to reflect experience rather than elegance. One striking anecdote from a milliner's letter recalls how women began decorating their bonnets with tiny snowflake pins made of tin and glass to commemorate the storm. She called them badges of the brave. Years later, one of those pins would be found in a time capsule placed beneath the foundation of a new railway station, a small tribute to endurance disguised as fashion. There's a peculiar humor that arises after survival, the kind that mixes gratitude with disbelief. A man on a street corner shouts, "50 cents to tell you how I didn't die," and people actually stop to listen. Laughter fills the air, hesitant at first, then bold. It feels good to hear it again. According to letters preserved in the Historical Society, some citizens began organizing small parades through the cleared streets, not to celebrate victory, but simply to prove they could walk together again. They wore mismatched coats, scarves of every color, and boots patched with string. The sound of their steps echoed down the avenues like a collective heartbeat. A peculiar entry from a young dressmaker's notebook describes how she kept her hands warm by sewing constantly. She made hats and scarves by candlelight, stitching till her fingers bled. "I did not stop because I was afraid to feel cold," she wrote. That hat shop reopened 2 weeks later and was flooded with orders from neighbors who remembered her kindness. Experts on social history have pointed out that disaster often changes how people see themselves, and nowhere is that clearer than in the clothes they wear. After the Great Blizzard, the city's attire shifted subtly. The layers, the heavy boots, the sensible fabrics all spoke of respect for nature's power. Vanity gave way, at least for a while, to humility. A newspaper column published later captured it best. "We have learned to dress not to impress, but to endure." The author probably meant it metaphorically, but the words fit both body and spirit. You look around now and see that truth everywhere. Children wear coats made from their father's old jackets. Street vendors tie rags around their shoes to keep from slipping. Even the wealthier residents look less polished, more human. The city, stripped of pretense, feels honest. A young woman passes you wearing a hat stitched from two different furs, mismatched but warm. She smiles shyly when she catches you looking. "Best I could do," she says, before continuing on her way. You smile too, realizing that warmth has taken on a new meaning. It isn't about appearance anymore. It's about kindness, resilience, and the small triumphs of each day. As the sun dips lower, the light catches on the melting snow, and the streets turn to mirrors. You see your reflection beside others, all bundled, weary, but alive. You can almost hear the city whispering to itself, "We made it through." You return home, hang your damp coat by the stove, and watch the steam rise from the fabric. The faint scent of wet wool fills the air. Outside, laughter drifts through the evening, mixed with the creak of wagons and the soft splash of melting ice. The storm is becoming memory now, but its mark remains on every person, in every patched sleeve and scuffed boot. It has changed not only what people wear, but how they carry themselves. Every layer is a story, every garment a quiet declaration. We survived, and we learned. You wake to the sound of wheels creaking and hooves clopping faintly against slush. The roads are opening again. When you step outside, the air feels lighter, the kind of cold that brushes rather than bites. The streets still glisten with ice, but now there are shapes moving along them, carts, sledges, wagons pulled by tired horses. The rhythm of commerce is creeping back into life. The first thing that strikes you is the smell. Coal smoke mingles with the scent of wet flour, salted meat, and thawing fish. Shopkeepers have thrown open their doors, not for business yet, but to scrape away the ice that seals them shut. You hear voices calling greetings, hammers tapping on frozen hinges, and laughter echoing between the tall walls of snow that still border every path. Records from the Chamber of Commerce show that trade in New York and Boston came to a complete halt during those frozen days. No goods moved, No deliveries arrived. Factories went cold, and markets starved of supplies. In a world that ran on coal and muscle, when the horses fell and the trains froze, time itself seemed to stop. A curious detail from a grocer's account book tells how he tried to keep milk from spoiling by burying it in snow. When the thaw came, the bottles were intact, their contents as fresh as the day they were sealed. He sold them at half price to celebrate, calling it storm-aged milk. His small act of optimism became a local joke repeated for years. Economic historians often point to the Great Blizzard as the first true test of an industrial city's dependence on constant motion. When that motion stopped, everything else did too. Wages paused, debts piled up, and entire industries froze alongside the streets. Yet from this stillness grew ideas that would change how cities handled crisis. Ice storage, emergency food depots, and reserve coal supplies all took root in the lessons of 1888. A peculiar report from a bookseller in Lower Manhattan describes his struggle to reopen. The snow had drifted through the cracked skylight and filled his shop to the shelves. He shoveled for 2 days to reach the counter, only to find the books dry beneath a crust of ice. He laughed when he wrote, "Even the words were preserved. That shop reopened within a week, and customers returned just to hear him tell the story." You walk now among the slow rebirth of daily life. Street vendors set up makeshift stalls on cleared corners, selling bread, apples, and roasted nuts. Coins clink, hands meet, eyes soften with relief. Trade is more than business, it is proof that hope has value again. One remarkable entry from a tailor's ledger notes how he stitched together scraps of fabric from ruined stock and sold them as storm quilts. People bought them gladly, not because they were beautiful, but because they were made from survival. Each piece told a story of what had endured. Researchers studying the blizzard's economic aftermath still disagree about how long it took for commerce to recover. Some say weeks, others months. But most agree that something intangible happened in those early days of reopening. People rediscovered the meaning of work itself. Labor became a way of rebuilding dignity, not just livelihood. A shopkeeper's wife wrote in her diary, "I never loved the sound of a broom before, but now it means life returning." She described how they swept the floors together, melted snow in pots to wash the counters, and lit lamps though there was little to sell. The act of readiness itself was a prayer. In neighborhoods where snow still blocked the streets, merchants climbed through second-story windows to reach their goods. A bakery near the Bowery sold loaves by lowering them on ropes into the tunnels below. The smell of warm bread rising through the cold air made people stop in their tracks and weep. That scent, they said, was the end of fear. A minor but memorable incident recorded in a police log tells of a milkman who strapped his cans to a pair of barrel staves and skied from house to house. Children followed him, cheering as if he were a hero. By the time he finished his route, the story had spread, and others began doing the same. For a few weeks, milk delivery in parts of the city was done on homemade skis. Modern sociologists note that humor returned faster than prosperity. People laughed to keep despair away. Street artists began carving small snow statues in the leftover drifts, cats, angels, and caricatures of city officials. Crowds gathered to admire them, the first public gatherings since the storm began. The snow that had trapped them became their canvas. You walk along Broadway and see shops reopening one by one. A bookseller sweeps his steps, a tailor hangs out a half-frozen sign, a baker leans in his doorway and smiles at passers-by. Every gesture feels monumental. You realize that rebuilding isn't always a single act, it's thousands of small decisions made quietly and repeated until they add up to living again. By afternoon, the streets are streaked with slush. Wagons roll slowly, wheels splashing through puddles that shine like mercury. Steam rises from manhole covers, carrying the smell of damp stone. You hear the faint chime of a bell from a streetcar still half buried but being cleaned. It is the sound of a promise, faint yet steady. An economist writing decades later said the Great Blizzard didn't just freeze the economy, It thawed arrogance. People learned that progress was fragile, that the future could vanish overnight. Yet from that humility came a more enduring strength, the understanding that community and perseverance were the true currencies of survival. You head home through the wet, gleaming streets, boots soaked, face flushed with cold. In a shop window, you see your reflection among others, each of you moving with the same quiet determination. Behind the glass, a sign reads, "Open again." You stop for a moment, smile, and keep walking. When night falls, the lamps shine brighter than before, as though the city wants to prove its light cannot be buried. The sound of footsteps and voices fills the air, gentle, rhythmic, alive. You close your eyes and listen, realizing that the heart of commerce isn't greed or profit, it's the need to share, to give, to live together again. The morning light returns slow and gold, resting softly on rooftops still capped with snow. You wake to the gentle hum of voices outside and the crackle of a fire in a neighbor's stove. The city is alive again, though quieter, thoughtful. You stretch your legs, pull on your boots, and step into the damp air that smells faintly of ink and coal dust. As you walk down the street, you notice something new. People are carrying paper letters, sketches, folded notes, and diaries clutched close as if they are treasures. After days of silence, they are recording, painting, remembering. The great blizzard is already being turned into story, into art, into something that can be survived twice, once in life and once on the page. According to recovered archives, diaries kept during and after the blizzard became one of the most valuable historical records of the event. Ordinary citizens, not officials or journalists, captured the heart of what had happened. They wrote by candlelight, with stiff fingers and frozen ink, describing not just the storm but how it felt to be small beneath it. One journal from a Brooklyn teacher reads, "The snow made us all students again. We learned humility as our lesson and patience as our homework." The phrasing is simple, but it carries the weary wisdom of someone who has looked fear in the face and found grace instead. There is a curious fragment of history tucked inside an artist's notebook from that same week. He sketched the tunnels and the people crawling through them, using soot mixed with melted snow for ink. The drawings were crude, but alive. Decades later, art historians would call them the first expressions of American urban realism. At the time, he just called them things I saw while waiting for the thaw. A well-documented truth from museum records tells that even children participated in preserving the storm. Schools collected essays from students describing their experiences. Some wrote about fear, others about adventure. One boy wrote that the snow made the city quiet enough to hear the moon. The collection of these essays still exists, yellowed but intact, a testament to the voices that rarely appear in history books. Experts still disagree on what these artifacts reveal about the people who lived through that week. Some say the abundance of diaries shows a collective need for control, an urge to frame chaos into meaning. Others think it was something simpler, a human instinct to speak, even when no one might ever read the words. A lesser-known anecdote from a letter published months later tells of a woman who tore up her diary pages and used them as kindling when her coal ran out. She wrote to a friend afterward, "I burn my words to keep my hands alive. If you are reading this, then perhaps that was worth it." That single sentence has become one of the most quoted reflections of the storm, a small, fiery truth about what survival really costs. In a small printing shop on the Lower East Side, the presses finally begin to run again. The sound is slow at first, gears clanking, rollers squealing, but soon steady. Newspapers pour out with stories of heroism, tragedy, and awe. Headlines call it the storm of the century, and engravings show streets buried beneath mountains of snow. Yet between the lines, there are glimpses of tenderness. Neighbors feeding each other, strangers rescuing children, laughter echoing in candlelight. A curious footnote appears in one of those papers, a poem titled White Silence, unsigned but attributed to a young printer's apprentice. It begins, "We built our homes of snow and slept in the hush of it," and ends with, "The city woke, but part of us stayed dreaming. Historians have never found the author's name, but the poem survived in reprints for years afterward. Artists, too, found their inspiration in the blizzard. Photographers ventured into the thawing streets to capture the strange light of the aftermath. Their glass plates froze and cracked, but some images survived the silhouettes of figures crossing buried bridges, carriages half swallowed by snow, lamplight glowing through fog. These pictures would later be displayed as symbols of human endurance, fragile but radiant. In one diary, a musician wrote about composing a piece for piano called Frozen Waltz. He said he could still hear the rhythm of the wind when he touched the keys. The melody was meant to sound like footsteps crunching in snow. No one knows if the sheet music remains, but his words do, written carefully across a page spotted with melted frost. Modern scholars sometimes call these journals and artworks the Quiet Chorus of 1888. They argue that this was how people reclaimed their agency by transforming what terrified them into something they could own, remember, and retell. As you walk through the streets now, you see it happening everywhere. Children draw snow tunnels with bits of charcoal on walls. A man sits by a window writing on the back of a ledger. A woman hums a song she's inventing as she sweeps. Creation fills the air, not loud or proud, but steady and human. A small boy stops to show you a picture he's drawn in the damp snow with a stick. It's a house, small but bright, with smoke curling from the chimney. He says proudly, "That's ours. It didn't fall. You nod, unable to speak for a moment, because there, in his simple drawing, is the entire story of endurance. By evening, the city hums with the sound of printing presses, pen nibs scratching, and voices reading aloud. Every retelling, every sketch, every diary entry becomes part of a living archive. The storm that buried the world is now being captured in ink and memory, so that it can never quite bury them again. You sit by your own small fire, open a blank page, and begin to write. Your hand trembles slightly, but the words come easily. It snowed until we forgot what colour was, and when colour returned, it felt like forgiveness. The ink dries slowly in the chill. You smile at the line, close the notebook, and listen to the soft, endless drip of melting snow outside. You wake late, the room already bright. The window glows with reflected sunlight, and for a moment you forget what month it is. The air smells faintly of damp paper, thawing mud, and smoke. Outside, water trickles through the gutters, running beneath thin ice like a stream trying to remember its course. The blizzard is finally over. Only its memory remains. You dress slowly, listening to the soft rhythm of dripping water. Each drop feels like a heartbeat of the city returning. When you open the door, the air that greets you is warmer, though still sharp enough to make your eyes water. You step outside into a world reshaped by weather and by will. Contemporary accounts describe this day as one of the strangest in memory. Streets that had been white and endless only days before were now streaked with black mud. Snow collapsed from rooftops in heavy slabs, crashing into the streets below. The sound startled even those who had survived the storm's roar. Yet the thaw felt like a miracle. A well-documented note from a weather observer stated that temperatures had risen 20 degrees in a single day. He described the city as a frozen clock, slowly starting to tick. It is a fitting image. People wandered the streets in wonder, measuring what had been lost and what remained. One curious entry from a banker's diary said that his watch had stopped during the height of the storm, and no matter how often he wound it, it refused to start again until this morning. Perhaps time itself waited for the thaw, he wrote. It might have been meant as poetry, but it feels true nonetheless. Historians still discuss what happened to the human sense of time during those days. Some call it the white suspension, a phrase that describes how routine simply dissolved. There was no Monday or Tuesday, no distinction between day and night, only survival, measured in breaths and shovels of snow. The thaw returned not just warmth but order, the rhythm of clocks and bells and footsteps. You walk through the streets and notice how the snow, once so pure, is now streaked with soot and ash. The beauty of it is gone, replaced by something more familiar, the mess of life. The air is alive with the dripping of ice, the creak of wagons, the clang of hammers striking rail lines. The noise feels chaotic, but it is the sound of motion restored. A peculiar memory recorded by a schoolboy describes this very sound. He wrote that the city sang as it melted. The water in the gutters gurgled like flutes, the icicles broke like chimes, and even the shovels hitting pavement made their own rhythm. He said it was the happiest noise he had ever heard. Researchers later noticed that survivors of the blizzard often described time differently afterward. Days felt slower, lighter, more deliberate. Some claim they could never again ignore the quiet between moments, as if the stillness of the storm had stayed inside them. Perhaps that is the true mark of such an event. It changes how you measure life itself. A forgotten column in a local newspaper reflects this same thought. The storm stopped our clocks, but it started our attention. The writer urged readers to look more closely at their own lives, to see beauty in simple things like firelight and laughter. The column was unsigned, but it became one of the most copied clippings of that year. In the countryside, the thaw was harder. Letters from farmers tell of barns caved in under the weight of melting snow, of fences crushed flat. But there are also stories of cattle emerging from drifts alive, shaking themselves free like creatures reborn. The smell of wet hay filled the fields again. In one account, a farmer wrote, "The silence broke first with a crow's call. I cried when I heard it." You stop by a small square where people are gathered, clearing ice from the statue of George Washington. The work is slow, but careful, almost reverent. Each chip of ice that falls reveals a bit more of the bronze beneath. Children cheer as the face reappears. It feels symbolic somehow. Leadership thawing from under the weight of the storm. A peculiar footnote from a city archivist says that hundreds of clocks across New York froze during the blizzard, their gears seized by cold. When repairmen visited afterward, many of those clocks were found to have stopped at almost the same moment, just after midnight on March 12th. No one can explain why, but people whispered that the storm itself had frozen time. You think about that as you walk. The sun glints on puddles and the air hums with energy. Somewhere, a street musician begins to play a harmonica. The sound is thin but bright, winding through the narrow lanes like smoke. Passers-by stop to listen, smiling faintly. After so much stillness, the simple act of hearing music feels profound. Even now, scholars argue about how quickly the city recovered. Some say it took weeks, others claim months. The records are incomplete, but perhaps the question misses the point. Recovery is not measured in speed, but in sound, in the scrape of shovels, the ring of bells, the voices calling across the thaw. You reach home just as the sky begins to dim. The light turns amber, reflecting off puddles like molten glass. The sound of dripping water continues into the night, steady and soft, like a lullaby. The clocks tick again, steady and defiant. You lie down near the stove, listening to the rhythm of the world returning. Time, once frozen, has begun to move. Each second feels deliberate, a gift. You close your eyes and let it carry you forward, one heartbeat at a time. You wake to the sound of shovels scraping, not in panic this time, but in purpose. The thaw has deepened, and now the work of freeing the buried city begins in earnest. When you open your window, the smell of wet wood and iron greets you. The air is full of motion, men calling, carts creaking, water running in rivulets down the packed streets. You dress quickly and step outside into the dazzling light of a city returning to itself. The snowbanks that once towered like frozen mountains are softening at their edges. Meltwater cuts narrow channels through them, turning the streets into shallow rivers. Everywhere you look, people dig. Some work in silence. Others sing or whistle as their shovels bite into the crusted snow. Their breath rises like smoke in the sun. You pick up a spade and join them, the cold metal familiar in your hands. City records from the following week tell of thousands of volunteers clearing the main avenues. Men, women, and children all took part. Teams were organized block by block, each responsible for digging to the nearest intersection. It wasn't just about reopening streets, it was about reclaiming a sense of order after days of chaos. A letter written by a fireman captures the feeling of that day perfectly. We dug as if we were uncovering the heartbeat of the city itself. His words are simple, but they carry the weight of truth. Every shoveled path became a vein through which life could flow again. A curious anecdote from a carriage driver describes how people began to build snow walls beside their houses instead of clearing them entirely. They used the ice as insulation, pressing it into place with buckets of water that froze again overnight. For a brief time, New York was a city made of stone and snow, half architecture, half accident. Meteorological data confirms that temperatures hovered near freezing during those days. It was a delicate balance, warm enough to melt, cold enough to refreeze each night. The result was a strange beauty roads lined with glassy ice that sparkled under lamplight, and roofs dripping in crystal chains. Survivors later remembered it as both treacherous and mesmerizing. Researchers today still discuss how the act of digging out became a social event. People who had never spoken to each other before shared tools, meals, and jokes. Friendships formed in the trenches. Marriages even began there. One woman's diary mentions meeting her future husband while handing him a cup of tea as he cleared her front steps. She wrote, "We built our path together, quite literally." A peculiar note from a street inspector's log mentions that the city's sounds changed as the digging continued. The muffled quiet of the blizzard gave way to a clanging symphony, shovels striking stone, sleigh bells ringing faintly, distant cheers when a street finally broke through to daylight. To those who lived through it, the noise itself felt like resurrection. A historian writing later would call this the communal thaw, a period when labor and relief became indistinguishable. People worked not for pay or praise, but for the satisfaction of movement, of feeling the world take shape again under their effort. You rest for a moment, leaning on your shovel, watching the steam rise from your breath. Children run past, their laughter sharp in the cold air. A boy pushes a small wooden cart filled with snow and dumps it into the gutter. He salutes you before running off again. The gesture feels like a promise. According to a city ledger, over 1 million cubic yards of snow were moved by hand during that week. The number is staggering, but standing here, surrounded by people working shoulder to shoulder, it almost feels believable. Every shoveled path is a line of hope written into the city's frozen script. A small but vivid report from a local paper describes how the diggers uncovered forgotten things as they worked. Lost gloves, toppled lampposts, whole wagons buried under drifts. One group even found a frozen piano upright in the middle of a street, its keys gleaming with frost. They cleared it carefully, and someone dared to strike a note. The sound was thin but pure, echoing down the street like a blessing. Later accounts describe that same piano as a symbol of recovery. People began to visit it each day, leaving flowers or coins on top, until it was finally taken away when the thaw deepened. Its story was retold so often that some doubted it ever existed, but it doesn't matter. What mattered was the image, art emerging from ice, sound returning to silence. As the sun climbs higher, the snow walls around you shrink. Streams run freely now, carrying bits of straw and ash down the gutter. The city's pulse is strong again. Workers cheer as the last buried streetcar is uncovered, its iron rails glinting like veins under the slush. In the afternoon, you help dig out a lamppost that had vanished completely. When the base is finally free, someone wipes the soot from its glass and lights the wick inside. The flame flickers, catches, and burns steady. The crowd claps quietly, not out of spectacle but respect. One historian wrote that the act of relighting those lamps marked the true end of the great blizzard. The streets glowed again, not with the cruel brightness of snow, but with the warm, steady promise of return. As dusk falls, you set your shovel aside and look down the long street you helped uncover. The lamps line both sides, their light golden against the deepening blue. The snow still glows faintly, holding the memory of the storm's brilliance, but the city beneath it is awake. You walk home slowly, boots heavy with slush, heart lighter than it has been in days. Inside, the stove crackles, and the sound of dripping water outside feels almost like applause. The world, for all its violence, has given you back its rhythm. By the time you wake again, the city is nearly free. The snow still lingers in corners and shadows, but the streets are open, the carriages moving, and the air filled with the hum of daily life. You can smell coal, smoke, and damp stone, hear the clang of streetcars, and see shopkeepers sweeping their stoops with pride. Yet even as life resumes, something quieter has settled in the hearts of the people. The blizzard has left its mark not just on the buildings, but on the way everyone looks at the sky. You walk along Broadway, where the air feels strangely clear. The sky is a deep, washed-out blue, and the sunlight catches on puddles left in the gutters. The city breathes again, though it breathes differently now, slower and more aware. You pass faces you recognize from those first terrible days, neighbors who knocked on walls, strangers who dug beside you. They nod when they see you, as though you all share a secret no one else could ever fully understand. According to official reports, the death toll from the Great Blizzard eventually reached over 400 across the northeastern states. Newspapers published lists of names in somber columns, yet the true number will never be known. Many who vanished left no record, and some were not found until the thaw. The city learned to mourn quietly. A letter from a young journalist describes walking through a field outside the city where the snow had melted unevenly. He wrote that each patch of ice looked like a small mirror catching the faces of the lost. The imagery is simple but haunting. It captures the way grief settles everywhere, shimmering, invisible, impossible to count. There is a curious anecdote about a woman who placed a candle in her window for each night of that week, one for every day the storm raged. She kept the candles burning long after the blizzard ended, saying it was for those who didn't make it home. When she finally blew them out, she said the air felt heavier, as if the house itself remembered the weight of their absence. Historians who study the storm still discuss the accuracy of the official death toll. Some claim it was undercounted to protect the city's reputation. Others believe it was exaggerated to secure federal aid. The truth remains elusive. Numbers are easier to write down than sorrow. One survivor's diary records the reopening of a small church near the harbour that became a gathering place for families seeking news. Inside, the pastor read the names of the missing, his voice trembling on certain ones. Between each reading, the congregation sat in silence. It was a silence deeper than prayer, the diarist wrote. It was as though the storm had passed through us and left a hollow we could never quite fill. A lesser-known story from the same church tells of a young boy who stood outside the doors with a slate board. Each time a family came in, he marked their names. Each time one came out, he erased them. It was his own way of keeping count. The board filled and emptied over and over, until by evening only smudges remained. Contemporary observers wrote that funerals were simple affairs. The ground was still too hard to dig easily, so graves were shallow, marked with temporary wooden crosses, until the thaw allowed proper burials. Coffins were carried on sledges instead of wagons. Flowers froze before they could be placed. Yet people came anyway, wrapped in scarves and silence, to stand together in the cold. One rare letter from a gravedigger reveals an unexpected tenderness. "I no longer dig holes," he wrote. "I make doors for the earth to welcome her children home." His words have been quoted countless times since, often without his name attached, but the sentiment endures. Even amid grief, the city's resilience showed itself in small, defiant ways. Musicians played again in taverns, and street performers returned, their songs softer now but filled with gratitude. One violinist played on a corner where bodies had once been found. Passers-by stopped, listening quietly. some weeping, some smiling through tears. A newspaper column titled "The List of the Lost" published personal stories beside the names. A milkman who vanished on his route, a mother found shielding her child, a sailor who left port too late. Each name became a thread in a larger tapestry of remembrance. Reading it now, you can feel the writer's exhaustion and compassion mingling in every line. In the countryside, memorials were carved into barn walls or fence posts. One farmer etched the date of the blizzard above his barn door with a pocket knife so his grandchildren would always remember. Another wrote, "We stayed. We endured." That phrase appears in many letters from that winter, as if the survivors needed a simple way to explain everything they'd seen. A historian who later studied those writings called it the birth of endurance as identity. The storm had turned ordinary citizens into chroniclers of perseverance. They didn't seek pity, they sought meaning. You walk past a small cemetery now, its iron gate half buried in ice. The headstones glisten with melting frost. A woman kneels beside one, her gloved hand resting on the cold stone. You don't speak. You simply tip your hat and keep walking. Respect feels more fitting than words. As dusk settles, the city grows quiet again, but not from fear. Lamps flicker to life one by one, and the golden light spills over the wet cobblestones. The names of the dead are known, but so too are the faces of those who lived, each carrying invisible proof of what it means to survive. That night, as you sit by your stove, you think of the hundreds lost and the thousands who remain. The storm has ended, but its lessons echo still, that warmth matters most when it is shared, that memory can outlast fear, and that grief, though heavy, can also make a city gentler. Outside, the wind has calmed to a whisper. Somewhere, a single candle still burns in a window, steady and bright against the dark. You watch it flicker through the glass and realize that the city, in its own quiet way, is still saying thank you. The morning feels different. The air is lighter, touched with the scent of damp wood and smoke from 100 stoves. When you step outside, the streets are nearly clear, puddles glinting like shards of mirror beneath the early light. Horses clop slowly through the slush, their breath hanging in white clouds. The city moves with care, like someone learning to walk again after an illness. People no longer speak of survival, at least not out loud. Now they talk of rebuilding, of lessons, of what must change, so that such a storm never traps them again. The great blizzard has shifted from experience to memory, and from memory to motivation. Historical documents record that within weeks of the thaw, the mayor and city engineers convened to discuss improvements to the city's infrastructure. It was clear that the storm had exposed the fragility of progress. Telegraph poles had fallen like matchsticks, and elevated railways had frozen solid. The solution, some argued, was not to abandon modernity but to bury it deeper, to protect it. A well-known report from the Engineering Committee stated that all new telegraph and electrical cables in Manhattan should be placed underground. The idea was revolutionary at the time. People feared that burying cables would make them impossible to repair, but the storm had proven that leaving them exposed made them useless anyway. A lesser-known anecdote from those debates reveals a moment of dark humor. One councilman reportedly joked that the city should also bury its politicians, since they tended to disappear in times of crisis. The line was recorded in a stenographer's notes, followed by the word laughter. Even in planning reform, people needed to laugh to keep their spirits from freezing again. Architectural historians now point to 1888 as the year when New York began to imagine itself vertically and underground at once. Elevated trains would rise above the snow, while new tunnels and subways would carry people safely below it. The storm had quite literally reshaped the city's sense of direction. A curious document from the archives of the Metropolitan Railway Company notes that during the blizzard, several engineers trapped in their offices sketched plans for an electric underground transit. Those rough drawings became the seed for what would later evolve into the subway system. The cold had inspired motion. Researchers who study the sociology of disaster argue that the blizzard gave birth to the modern city not through destruction, but through embarrassment. The paralysis of 1,888 had been witnessed by the entire nation. Newspapers from San Francisco to London printed illustrations of New Yorkers trudging through waist-high snow. Pride demanded improvement. The storm's humiliation became the engine of innovation. One observer, writing in a Boston journal, called it progress by snowdrift. The phrase caught on, reappearing in editorials across the country. It meant that even catastrophe could be a form of instruction, if only people were willing to learn. A small but vivid record from a civil servant's notebook describes the first team tasked with inspecting telegraph lines after the storm. They walked miles through slush and rubble, noting which poles had fallen and which had survived. He wrote, "We made a map of failure, so we would know where to begin success." The simplicity of the line captures the tone of the times, practical, unpoetic, yet quietly profound. In a downtown tavern, tradesmen gather to discuss new ways to build. One man proposes reinforced chimneys, another suggests thicker glass for windows, and a third insists that future homes should have doors that open inward, so snow cannot trap people inside. They argue good-naturedly, fueled by ale and memory. The storm has turned ordinary citizens into inventors. A letter from a schoolteacher to her sister speaks of how her students now study weather with new seriousness. They record temperatures daily and read about clouds. "We watch the sky as if it were a teacher," she writes. "It can be cruel, but it always tells the truth." Her words sound almost like prayer. Experts today still debate whether the reforms that followed the blizzard were driven by logic or by fear. Some believe the city would have modernized eventually, storm or not. Others insist that only disaster has the power to force change at such a scale. Both sides may be right. History often needs both reason and shock to move forward. As you walk through the streets, you notice new wooden markers beside the telegraph poles. Workers are measuring, planning, mapping. The sound of their tools blends with the city's low hum. Life is no longer paused. It is redesigning itself. A peculiar entry from a newspaper column mentions a slogan scribbled on a wall near City Hall. "Next time, we'll be ready." It is written in coal dust, uneven and bold. No one knows who wrote it, but it captures the spirit of this moment, a mix of defiance, hope, and hard-earned wisdom. By afternoon, the city glows under a thin veil of mist. The melting snow gives the streets a mirror-like sheen. You catch reflections of wagons, lamplighters, and children chasing each other through puddles. The sound of hammers echoes from rooftops, where repairs are already underway. The city is not mourning anymore. It is rehearsing for the future. A journalist covering these efforts wrote that New York seemed to have grown taller in its shadow. The phrase stayed in your mind as you watched the lamplighters move through the haze. It's true. The storm may have broken the city, but in rebuilding, it found a kind of grace. When night falls, the lamps flicker to life one by one, their flames steady against the gentle breeze. You pause, looking at the faint glow along the street, thinking of the people now beneath those lights, diggers, clerks, builders, dreamers, all working toward a city that will remember this lesson. You head home slowly, boots wet from puddles, coat heavy with damp air. The sound of distant laughter follows you, mingling with the hiss of steam and the whisper of melting snow. It feels like closure, though not the end. The storm has changed everything, but in its wake, the city has begun to rise, both literally and within the human heart. The sun climbs higher each morning now, and the light feels softer. When you wake, the windows no longer glisten with frost. The last of the snow clings to corners of roofs, melting slowly into gutters that gurgle like tiny rivers. Spring is near, though it arrives quietly, as if reluctant to disturb the fragile calm left behind. You walk outside and find the city humming again, not yet loud, but steady. The air smells of damp earth, coal smoke, and a faint sweetness from early buds pushing through the thawed soil in the parks. Horses pull carts laden with supplies, and children splash through puddles where snowbanks once towered. The Great Blizzard has become a story now, one people tell to test their own disbelief. According to newspapers from that spring, people began collecting tales of the storm. Families cut out clippings, saving them in scrapbooks. School teachers asked students to write essays about what they had seen. For the first time, ordinary citizens across the country shared a single narrative, not of war or politics, but of weather and endurance. A peculiar letter printed in the Springfield Republican tells of a woman who baked loaves shaped like snowdrifts to commemorate the storm's anniversary the following year. She wrote, "I do not bake to celebrate suffering, but to remember how warm a kitchen can be when the world outside forgets warmth." That sentence, reprinted countless times, became a small emblem of domestic courage. Researchers who study cultural memory often point to the blizzard of 1888 as one of the first events to unite Americans through shared experience rather than shared victory. The storm was indiscriminate, striking rich and poor alike, city dwellers and farmers. It left behind not triumph, but humility, a recognition that nature could silence every difference in a single night. A curious story from rural New Hampshire describes how one family carved the date of the storm into a large oak tree on their property. Each spring thereafter, they gathered beneath it for a picnic, calling it the day we stayed inside. The tradition lasted decades. Even after the tree fell, its trunk was kept in a barn, a reminder that survival can be something worth celebrating quietly. In cities across the Northeast, artists began to paint scenes from the blizzard. Some depicted suffering, others serenity. One painter showed a woman lighting a lantern against a blue-white window. Another painted children building tunnels that glowed like cathedrals of snow. Critics at the time dismissed the works as sentimental, but later generations saw in them the first stirrings of modern realism, truth born from hardship. A well-known writer of the era published an essay titled "The Snow That Taught Us." He described the storm as a teacher too harsh to love, but too honest to ignore. His words resonated widely, inspiring new efforts to improve weather prediction. Within a few years, telegraph-linked weather stations expanded across the country, turning observation into something approaching science. There is a delightful bit of trivia tucked into those same years. The phrase "snow day" appeared for the first time in print in 1889, used by a teacher recalling how the blizzard had forced the closure of every school. Children, she wrote, had cheered even as their parents despaired. The term would outlive the storm, finding its way into every winter afterward. Experts in folklore note how quickly the blizzard passed into legend. Some stories became exaggerated. People claimed drifts rose higher than houses, that wolves roamed the streets, that whole towns vanished. But exaggeration, too, is a form of survival. The bigger the story, the safer it feels to remember. One lesser-known anecdote from a librarian's journal tells how the storm changed reading habits. With people trapped indoors, book circulation soared in the weeks that followed. She wrote, "It seems the snow made readers of us all." The public libraries of New York and Boston soon saw record numbers, a quiet revival of curiosity born from confinement. Historians continue to discuss whether the blizzard truly transformed society or merely exposed its weaknesses. Some argue it accelerated modernization. Others insist it only reminded people of nature's supremacy. Yet all agree that something intangible shifted a humbler understanding of how small humans are within their world. You stop at a corner where a group of young men is clearing the last chunks of ice from a drain. They laugh as they work, their energy contagious. One of them calls out that they should save a piece of snow to remember it by. Another replies, "It's remembered already," in the stories. You smile, knowing he is right. A city newspaper that week printed an editorial titled "The Future Beneath the Frost." It predicted that people would look back on the blizzard, not with fear, but with respect. "It showed us our weakness," the editor wrote, "and by showing it, made us stronger." The sentence still feels true now, as sunlight spreads across the wet stones. In the parks, crocuses begin to appear where the drifts once lay. Children chase each other, their laughter ringing clear. Street musicians play again, their notes mingling with the trickle of water in the gutters. The city seems lighter, not because it has forgotten the storm, but because it has remembered how to move through it. As evening falls, you stand on a bridge overlooking the river. The water flows freely again, dark and reflective, carrying small chunks of ice out to sea. The wind is gentle, carrying a faint scent of salt. You watch the horizon glow pink, then fade to violet. For the first time in weeks, the sky looks like it belongs to spring. You close your eyes, hearing the faint hum of distant voices, the rattle of wheels, the call of a vendor selling roasted chestnuts. All of it feels like music, each note a thread connecting the storm to what comes after. The great blizzard of 1888 has ended, but its echoes linger in art, in memory, and in the quiet strength of the people who endured it. When you walk home, the air feels softer against your skin. You breathe deeply, the taste of winter still there but fading. Above you, the stars are bright, their light steady and patient. The city, washed clean and tired, sleeps beneath them like a child who has cried and finally found rest. The morning greets you with silence, not the heavy kind that came before the blizzard, but the gentle quiet of spring arriving. The air through the window feels mild, carrying the faint scent of soil and the promise of rain. The city has softened overnight. Patches of grass glimmer along the sidewalks, and the trees stand dark and wet, ready to bloom again. You rise slowly, stretch, and for the first time in weeks, the chill no longer bites at your fingers. When you step outside, the streets are alive with sound. Wheels turning, water trickling, voices rising and falling in ordinary conversation. It feels miraculous that such simple noises could exist again. The last of the snow clings to shaded corners, thin and grey, like a memory refusing to let go. But the wind carries warmth now, and the city exhales as if finally allowed to rest. According to city archives, by this point nearly every major road had reopened. Telegraph lines hummed again, ferry service resumed, and mail began to flow north and south without interruption. Yet the city itself had changed. Newspapers from the time note a newfound patience in the crowds, a gentler rhythm to the mornings. The storm had taught the city humility. A well-documented essay by a reporter who survived the blizzard described the transformation vividly. "We measure time differently now," he wrote. "Before, an hour was something to spend. Now, it is something to keep." His words caught the spirit of the age. People no longer rushed in quite the same way. They looked up more often, watched the sky, noticed the weather with respect instead of irritation. A curious note from a merchant's journal describes how customers lingered longer in his shop after the thaw. He wrote, "They talk before they buy. They smile as they count their coins. It is as if we have all remembered that we need one another to live." His handwriting trails off near the bottom of the page, as though words themselves could not quite capture the gratitude. Experts in urban psychology have since said that large disasters often leave invisible marks on the spirit of a place. Streets can be cleared, houses rebuilt, but the collective memory lingers like scent after rain. The great blizzard of 1888 became one of those invisible landmarks, shaping not just architecture or policy, but how people moved through their days. A small but striking detail appears in letters from that spring. People wrote more. Friends who had gone months without exchanging words began corresponding again. Neighbors who had barely known each other sent notes of thanks. It was as if everyone needed to speak into the silence the storm had left behind. One letter found years later in a family trunk reads, "We were strangers before the snow, but I will never pass your window again without remembering the sound of your knock. It is unsigned, but that only makes it more universal, a reminder that kindness often arrives quietly and stays long after. Even now, historians debate whether the blizzard marked an end or a beginning. Some call it the final storm of the old century, others the first lesson of the modern one. The truth is that it was both. It ended an age of careless faith in progress and began a new respect for the elements that shape every life, whether through invention or destruction. You walk to the park, where children run over the damp grass, their laughter bright. Pigeons gather around breadcrumbs scattered by an old man on a bench. The pond has thawed completely, reflecting the pale sky. The trees, though still bare, are dotted with buds that tremble in the breeze. Life is returning, as quietly as it left. A musician stands on a corner near the gates, his violin case open at his feet. He plays softly, the melody light and searching. The tune drifts through the air, weaving between carriages and footsteps. For a moment, you close your eyes and imagine the sound as part of the city's heartbeat, proof that beauty still blooms even after cold and silence. According to oral histories collected decades later, people continued to tell stories of the Great Blizzard to their grandchildren. Some told them with awe, others with laughter, most with gratitude. They remembered the white walls, the frozen rails, the candles flickering in buried rooms. They spoke of courage not as something grand, but as the simple act of staying kind in the dark. You pause beside a lamppost, running your gloved hand over the metal still cold from the night. The city around you hums with life, but there is stillness in your chest, the calm that comes only after surviving something immense. You realize the blizzard was never just about snow. It was about connection, the fragile threads that hold people together when everything else falls apart. The sky is clear now. The clouds have drifted east, and a soft wind carries the scent of wet stone and coal smoke fading into spring air. The storm that once swallowed the world has become a story whispered between generations, a shared heartbeat that says, "We were tested, and we endured." As the sun begins to set, light washes the streets in gold. The snow that remains turns to silver in the distance, the last glimmer of winter's hold. You walk home slowly, each step sinking into soft mud that will soon give way to grass. In your window, the reflection of the city trembles gently in the fading light, whole again. The great blizzard of 1888 is gone now, but its lessons remain folded into every warm room, every shared glance, every candle lit against the cold. The world moves on as it always does, but in its quiet corners, memory keeps watch. Now the noise fades, the last shovels rest. The lamps outside glow steady, their halos soft in the dusk. You sit near the window, watching the evening unfold. The city breathes quietly, its heartbeat slow and sure. The air through the glass feels warmer, filled with the faint hum of distant voices. You close your eyes and let the sound of melting water fill the space between your thoughts. Each drip seems to mark a moment letting go. The storm has melted not just from the streets but from the spirit. You can feel the peace of exhaustion, the gentleness that follows struggle. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoes faintly across the thawed river. It does not sound lonely. It sounds like return. You imagine those who once huddled in the dark now sitting by their fires, telling stories, their laughter quiet but real. The world that froze has remembered how to move. You breathe slowly, the air soft on your lungs. The city outside may sleep soon, but it is not afraid of silence anymore. You picture the snow melting from the highest